Ringraziamento Eleonora, sono molto lieto di portare i saluti miei personali e questa è una situazione, come sappiamo, particolare che purtroppo continua a perdurare. Avrei avuto piacere di incontrare ciascuno di voi direttamente nel nostro dipartimento. Al momento appunto questo non è stato possibile, ma sono assolutamente fiducioso che ci saranno delle nuove possibilità, anche perché, e ringrazio appunto in questo momento la collega Eleonora De Stefanis, anche perché, dicevo, Eleonora De Stefanis è particolarmente attiva non soltanto nel portare avanti studi, ricerche, scavi archeologici importanti, appunto in particolare, ma non solo, nel nostro territorio, ma è anche particolarmente attiva appunto nell'organizzare giornate seminariali, giornate di convegni come questo, per cui appunto sono assolutamente certo che ci saranno delle occasioni appunto diverse di poterci conoscere, per conoscere appunto di persona. Sono lieto anche molto del fatto che pur in questa veste appunto telematica sia stato organizzato questo convegno che ha come focus centrale di interesse un tema certamente suggestivo ed importante come quello appunto dei reliquiari, e sono lieto del fatto che abbia questo convegno una dimensione internazionale che va appunto ormai, come tutti noi sappiamo, in una direzione molto che sempre più sono appunto apprezzati e che vanno proprio nella direzione della ricerca, dello sviluppo della ricerca e della divulgazione anche della ricerca a livelli scientifici che sono decisamente importanti. Quindi questo è per dire che da un lato abbiamo Eleonora De Stefanis, che è la collega appunto che è molto molto attiva nella ricerca, e dall'altro lato abbiamo anche consentitemi appunto di dirlo, un dipartimento di studi umanistici che eccelle per la ricerca scientifica. Siamo stati considerati tra i dipartimenti, quindi le ex facoltà di lingue, lettere e filosofia, un dipartimento appunto di eccellenza per la ricerca, e questo riconoscimento arriva dal Ministero, quindi ci fa particolarmente piacere, e proprio in questa direzione va anche il congresso che oggi Eleonora appunto ha organizzato con voi. Io non voglio rubarvi tempo perché so che i lavori sono decisamente densi, ma mi consentirete però da francesista, mi consentirete intanto di ringraziare tutti voi, ciascuno appunto di voi, per aver partecipato, per partecipare appunto a questo convegno, e dall'altro vorrei anche ringraziare e ricordare come francesista appunto l'importanza per il nostro dipartimento degli scambi con ciascuna delle vostre università, ma in particolare degli scambi con le università francesi che vedo qua anche rappresentate, l'Université de Lyon 3, l'Université Paris-Nanterre, l'Université Paris-Sorbonne, les collègues avec qui on a des rapports scientifiques et didactiques à plusieurs niveaux, et avec lesquels on a aussi des rapports interdisciplinaires importants qu'on souhaite finalement de continuer et d'améliorer à fur et à mesure que, disons, le temps passera. Donc, je souhaite a tout le monde la bienvenue, un buon travail, quindi auguro a tutti un ottimo lavoro, e spero che questo convegno, anzi sono certo che questo convegno permetterà non soltanto un confronto proficuo, ma permetterà anche di aggiungere dei nuovi tasselli nella dimensione della ricerca, tasselli sui quali già so Eleonora De Stefanis è particolarmente produttiva e ha già indagato in altre occasioni. Quindi vi lascio ai vostri lavori, vi ringrazio molto, nella speranza, appunto, come dicevo, di potervi poi conoscere personalmente, incontrare con piacere personalmente.
Grazie Michele, grazie molte al professor Mastroianni. Dottor Bellardone, se vuole intervenire.
Sicuramente, grazie, buongiorno a tutti.
Buongiorno.
Come presidente della Fondazione del Tesoro del Duomo, sono lieto di partecipare a questo convegno, anche se svolto in modalità da remoto a causa dell'emergenza sanitaria, portando anche i saluti istituzionali della Fondazione che rappresento. Apro il convegno Custodire il Sacro con un augurio che si possa svolgere nel migliore dei modi e con immutato interesse, anche se in lontananza. Tale subentrata modalità ha comunque permesso la partecipazione di quasi 200 iscritti collegati in tutto il mondo, rendendo ancora più internazionale l'evento. Un particolare ringraziamento deve essere formulato a tutti i dipartimenti dell'Università del Piemonte Orientale che con tenacia e grande capacità di coordinamento è riuscito a organizzare e comunque garantire questo interessante incontro, anche con il supporto della segreteria organizzativa del nostro museo, della diocesi e grazie anche alla Fondazione CRV che ci ha supportato dal punto di vista finanziario. La professoressa De Stefanis, che unitamente ad altri docenti dell'Università del Piemonte Orientale collabora da diversi anni con noi, con svariati progetti di ricerca multidisciplinare, ha quindi sapientemente valorizzato un discorso affascinante e ancora ricco di sorprese. Le reliquie, che rappresentano un tema prioritario nella società del primo millennio, aprendo diverse implicazioni e nuovi studi nell'ambito del sacro, e il museo che rappresento potrà essere un esempio per la custodia e la valorizzazione di tali reliquie, unitamente a tutti i relatori che seguiranno il convegno. Sarà quindi per noi un'importante occasione per aprirsi a confronti e a nuovi punti di vista. Quindi non rubo altro tempo, auguro a tutti voi un buon lavoro, nella speranza di poterci incontrare a breve e mostrare di persona i beni contenuti nel nostro interessante museo. Grazie e buon lavoro a tutti.
Grazie molte. Grazie molte. L'architetto De Luca, se...
Buongiorno. Buongiorno Eleonora, buongiorno a tutti voi, un buongiorno a tutti i relatori, gli organizzatori e i partecipanti a questo interessantissimo convegno. Quindi in rappresentanza dell'Arcidiocesi, in qualità di direttore dell'Ufficio Beni Culturali, porgo un saluto a tutti voi, portando anche un saluto istituzionale dall'Arcivescovo di Vercelli, quindi Monsignor Marco Arnolfo. Quindi il convegno Custodire il Sacro, organizzato dal Dipartimento di Studi Umanistici del Lupo, con la collaborazione del Museo del Tesoro del Duomo e l'Arcidiocesi, con il sostegno importantissimo di Fondazione CRV, è certamente una grande occasione scientifica per trattare un argomento molto particolare e interessante, le reliquie, ma soprattutto le relative custodie che sono state realizzate per contenere con così tanta attenzione questi elementi così affascinanti per bellezza, per preziosità e significato anche religioso. Non possiamo dimenticare questo aspetto, legato quindi molto alla devozione, per le forme, per le funzioni e anche per gli usi diversi. Quindi molti studiosi in questo convegno dialogheranno confrontando esperienze, studi, concentrandosi sul periodo antico fino al primo medioevo, quindi un momento particolarmente ricco e importante, ricco di interesse, dove c'è anche molto da apprendere ancora, perché è misterioso sotto tanti aspetti, così da approfondire anche proprio quelle attività e quegli aspetti legati alla Chiesa del tempo, che sono assolutamente interessantissimi. Quindi un particolare speciale ringraziamento lo rivolgo alla professoressa Eleonora De Stefanis e al suo dipartimento, che con grande forza di volontà e metodo è veramente riuscita a garantire questo importante convegno con le modalità che adesso ci sono consentite, e per fortuna ci sono anche questi mezzi. Quindi speriamo di poterci incontrare nel luogo dove il convegno doveva svolgersi e che la diocesi e il seminario avevano reso disponibili proprio per realizzare questo convegno, così da poter effettuare una visita anche alla cattedrale e al museo. Quindi l'occasione speriamo possa essere ad esempio quella della presentazione degli atti del convegno che auspico possano eseguirsi, così da lasciare anche un'importante traccia scritta proprio di questo grande momento culturale. Quindi ancora un saluto a tutti voi, un grandissimo augurio di buon lavoro e cordiali saluti.
Grazie molte. Bene, allora possiamo incominciare, dopo questi calorosi auguri, diciamo, possiamo incominciare il nostro lavoro e a questo punto chi guiderà la nostra giornata sarà il professor Jean-Pierre Caillet, a cui lascio subito la parola per la presidenza.
Grazie Eleonora. Non abbiamo del tutto finito con i ringraziamenti e non vorrei iniziare questa sessione senza dare in primo il mio caro saluto a tutti voi, ringraziare calorosamente la collega e l'amica Eleonora di Stephanis per l'organizzazione di questo, che ha permesso l'organizzazione di questo convegno, un'organizzazione non tanto facile, si può indovinare, ma si è riuscito e si riuscirà anche mediante la pubblicazione a dare qualcosa di veramente imponente, ne sono sicuro. Come siamo ancora in tempi, non vorrei mancare di mandare i miei auguri più sinceri a tutti voi e anche a tutti i vostri per quest'anno nuovo, un anno che speriamo sarà più felice di quello che è già passato adesso. Dunque, non vorrei rubare di più il vostro tempo e dunque cominceremo la nostra sessione di Eleonora di Stephanis stessa. Dunque, Eleonora, prendi la parola.
Grazie, sì, prendo la parola brevemente, ma per presentare un po', introdurre il nostro convegno. Allora presento subito il PowerPoint. Eccoci qua. Spero che lo vediate. Bene. Allora, possiamo quindi aprire i lavori del nostro convegno, che è dedicato a un tema particolare, quello del custodire il sacro, come indica appunto il titolo che abbiamo scelto. Custodire, e qui mi scuseranno i colleghi e tutti i partecipanti non italiani se inizio con una parola italiana, che però rimanda a un lessico comune a tutti noi, che è il latino. È un termine dal significato complesso che rimanda al custos, una parola la cui etimologia, come studi anche recenti hanno dimostrato, indica colui che siede accanto a qualcosa che è contenuto dentro qualcos'altro. Ebbene, l'atto del custodire implica quindi molteplici sfumature lessicali che riflettono perfettamente le valenze di oggetti come i reliquiari. Intanto c'è la conservazione e il mantenimento nel tempo di un contenuto prezioso, ma anche la protezione, la sorveglianza fisica e al tempo stesso metaforica di questo contenuto, la cura, l'attenzione, che diventa anche devozione, venerazione e coinvolge la dimensione spirituale al livello più alto. E come indica l'etimologia stessa che ho richiamato, c'è questa idea del sedere accanto a qualcosa, suggerire un rapporto anche fisico intrinseco di profondo è quello che si instaura almeno con alcuni reliquiari personali, basti pensare a quelli che erano portati in sospensione al collo o comunque sul corpo del devoto. Emerge contestualmente anche un nesso inscindibile, senza il quale il reliquiario non ha ragione di esistere, cioè quello fra contenuto e contenitore. Un tema che a livello più generale è entrato nella riflessione della comunità scientifica internazionale negli ultimi anni. Un volume del 2007 che significativamente si intitola De l'écran au cercueil, essai sur le contenants au Moyen Âge, ricordava come enfermer, protéger, conserver est une nécessité, un devoir pour toute civilisation. Le Moyen Âge n'échappe pas à la règle. Enclore, c'est continuer à faire vivre dans l'attente de renouvellement. I reliquiari sono tra gli oggetti sicuramente più rappresentativi in questo senso, perché racchiudono, proteggono, custodiscono quanto di più prezioso si possa concepire, cioè il sacro e la sua materializzazione. Nel caso dei nostri particolarissimi contenitori si integra tuttavia un ulteriore aspetto, un valore aggiunto possiamo dire, proprio per il contatto con la reliquia, quale che sia la natura di questa, ma poi ne accennerò brevemente, e per la nota convinzione della capacità di propagazione della virtus della reliquia a tutto ciò che con essa entra in contatto, anche i contenitori diventano oggetti sacri, sacralizzati proprio dalla funzione primaria di ospitare la reliquia. Tuttavia, se il mondo delle reliquie è da molto tempo uno dei temi forti della storiografia che si occupa del mondo tardo antico e poi medievale, bizantino, i contenitori di reliquie hanno conosciuto minore attenzione, almeno per alcuni aspetti e fino ad anni recenti. Certamente sono da tempo percepiti come componenti essenziali di un universo devozionale complesso, come si evince da alcuni studi ancora oggi fondamentali, ne cito solo alcuni, proprio solo en passant, come il volume di Joseph Braun, che con questa preziosa raccolta di tavole forniva già un'ampia illustrazione dei molteplici tipi di reliquiari in una lunga prospettiva diacronica. Più recente, negli anni 70, abbiamo la rassegna altrettanto fondamentale di Helmut Buschhausen di Spectromische Metallskrymia, ma anche negli anni successivi poi o immediatamente precedenti sono stati numerosi gli studi che si sono susseguiti, anche attraverso cataloghi di mostre, tra cui anche qui solo a titolo esemplificativo la mostra di Parigi, Trésor des Églises de France, per un periodo un po' più avanzato la mostra di Colonia, Ornamenta Ecclesiae, e negli decenni successivi poi anche altre importanti esposizioni hanno contribuito proprio a richiamare l'attenzione su questi temi, quindi anche qui solo per citare qualche caso americano, Age of Spirituality e Treasures of Heaven, che hanno dato un contributo importante. Peraltro per quest'ultima mostra è stato anche possibile fruire di materiali che sono tuttora disponibili online in un concetto di fruizione allargata e duratura nel tempo attraverso i nuovi mezzi di diffusione della conoscenza che peraltro stiamo anche sperimentando ormai nel nostro quotidiano. L'attenzione al mondo dei reliquiari si è intensificata in anni recenti con nuovi importanti studi, ne cito alcuni solo così a livello anche qui di puramente rappresentativo, ma importantissimi: Galit Nogabanai, The Trophies of the Martyrs, Anja Kalinowski, Frühchristliche Reliquiere, Cinzia Hahn, Strange Beauty. Vi sono molti importanti contributi in questo senso e anche che hanno anche permesso alla ricerca sui reliquiari di acquisire nuove e altamente innovative prospettive. Molta attenzione è stata riservata ormai da decenni alle molteplici forme che i reliquiari possono assumere, arrivando anche ad una visione estesa, diciamo, che interpreta un'intera architettura, cioè la chiesa che ospita le reliquie o il corpo santo, come santuario e quindi come un monumentale reliquiario. Sin dall'età tardo-antica i contenitori per reliquie o che hanno assunto tale funzione, ma poi tornerò su questi aspetti, mostrano una notevole diversificazione di forme, di dimensioni, materiali, dai piccoli oggetti metallici a cassetta ovale o quadrangolare, come quelli che vedete nell'immagine, talora lisci o con semplici ornati, mentre altre volte sono riccamente decorati, sino ai reliquiari in pietra con formati a sarcofago, in qualche caso di maggiori dimensioni, di maggior taglia, sino ad altri più elaborati a forma di prisma, e ancora alle cassette in avorio, talora di raffinatissima fattura. In un momento un po' più avanzato dell'Alto Medioevo occidentale compaiono i cosiddetti reliquiari a borsa, di dimensioni comunque sempre piuttosto contenute, spesso con un'anima in legno rivestita da lamine metalliche e da placchette in osso. E talvolta si raggiungono dei altissimi livelli nella produzione orafa, ma ne vedremo sicuramente molti durante il nostro convegno. In alcuni casi il reliquiario assume la forma della reliquia che contiene, come nel caso delle croci, ma questa non è una regola sempre verificata. Le reliquie della vera croce sono anche ospitate, ad esempio, in stauroteche a cassetta, il cui coperchio riproduce all'esterno la croce, come quella che vediamo nell'immagine, croce il cui frammento è contenuto all'interno. La funzione mimetica del reliquiario non è sempre verificata, come dicevo, e la corrispondenza tra la forma del contenitore e l'identificazione del contenuto non è affatto automatica. Il reliquiario può essere allusivo agli attributi del santo a cui rimandano le reliquie, come per le piccole chiavi, probabilmente in oro, contenenti la limatura delle catene di San Pietro, che Gregorio Magno invia a diversi sovrani, come si deduce da alcune lettere del pontefice, che raccomanda di portarle al collo. Piccole croci reliquiario di diversa foggia erano invece portate a contatto con il corpo. Un ruolo importante che si sta sempre più mettendo in luce è quello delle stoffe, che talora sono il materiale più a diretto contatto con la reliquia, in cui essa è avvolta, e a loro volta questi involucri, spesso sete orientali, sono contenuti all'interno di altri reliquiari. Del resto, altri oggetti, non pensati con la funzione primaria di contenitore, possono a loro volta ospitare reliquie, come nel caso di alcune, forse nel caso di alcune placche di cintura cosiddette burgunde, che accolgono al loro interno una cavità in cui sono stati ritrovati materiali vari, infiorescenze di cotone, capelli umani, ma poi sulla funzione ovviamente di questi materiali ci sarebbe molto da discutere, magari ne parleremo. Queste considerazioni portano ancora una volta al rapporto contenitore-contenuto, perché le reliquie sono, come noto, di vario tipo, sia corporee, sia ottenute in vario modo, per contatto o per prossimità con il focus di massima venerazione. Come nel caso dell'olio che ardeva nelle lucerne nei luoghi santi della Palestina, del Mediterraneo orientale o sulle tombe dei martiri romani, olio che i pellegrini raccoglievano in ampolle di metallo, più frequentemente di terracotta, come anche quelle diffusissime egiziane di San Mena per l'acqua miracolosa del santuario, o ancora in piccoli contenitori di vetro. Al di là delle forme e della loro evoluzione nel tempo, tuttavia, gli studi recenti stanno restituendo ai reliquiari tutta la loro straordinaria profondità di oggetti storici, diciamo, a tutto tondo. Restano comunque aperti problemi sulla funzione di alcuni cofanetti, specialmente quando il contesto di ritrovamento non è noto o è incerto, e questo avviene nella maggior parte dei casi. In alcune situazioni essi poterono ospitare l'ostia o anche ospitare l'ostia o l'olio sacramentale ancora, e svolgere il ruolo di crismaria o crismalia, come sembra indicare l'iscrizione runica del cofanetto di Mortain in Francia, che menziona il chismel come crisma, l'olio utilizzato per la somministrazione sacramentale. Per molti di essi, in parte anche quelli che ho mostrato, il dibattito sulla funzione è aperto e resta la possibilità che essi abbiano assolto altri compiti o che siano stati concepiti per altri scopi e poi nel tempo siano stati utilizzati come reliquiari. Non dimentichiamo poi, in un campo che sconfina nel giuridico sacramentale, che sulle reliquie si giura ed esse sono portate in giudizio, intervengono nei processi con un ruolo attivo, come forza capace di compiere miracoli e di dirimere controversie. In questi atti solenni le reliquie sono presenti attraverso i loro contenitori, come ci illustra questa bella immagine dell'arazzo di Bayeux nell'XI secolo con il giuramento di Harald sui due reliquiari. Numerose altre riflessioni naturalmente si impongono studiando i reliquiari e avremo occasione di parlarne in queste due giornate. Ne suggerisco solo alcune, così come spunti di ragionamento. Il reliquiario è il medium per eccellenza tra la reliquia e il mondo esterno. Sul piano materiale i media possono essere molteplici, come una sorta di scatole cinesi con contenitori diversi per forma e per materiali, che creano quei fenomeni di emboîtement dai complessi significati così presenti peraltro in tutto il mondo medievale, in più ambiti. Questi sono aspetti che si ricollegano al grande tema dei contesti d'uso e dell'accesso alle reliquie, in primo luogo della loro visibilità. Esse sono spesso intuibili soltanto attraverso i loro contenitori, la loro presenza è percepibile unicamente attraverso i reliquiari che le accolgono, e questi sono spesso a loro volta non visibili per la loro collocazione. I reliquiari spesso, non sempre, ci sono alcune aree in cui questo non è verificato, ma sono occultati al di sotto, all'interno di altari, in loculi, fosse più o meno costruite, che condividono con gli oggetti la funzione di protezione, ma anche di sottrazione della reliquia al contatto diretto, sotto qualunque forma che non sia la devozione o la comunione spirituale. Essi possono trovarsi inseriti in murature o in elementi architettonici come colonne o capitelli, ma si trovano anche all'interno di altri contesti chiusi, come le tombe, per esempio, e avremo anche qui occasione di parlare di questi aspetti. I reliquiari poi possono però essere anche oggetti estremamente mobili, come quelli portati al collo, in borse, sacchetti di tessuto, cuoio, stoffa, che riusciamo solo raramente a immaginare perché non conservati o quasi mai conservati. Nelle occasioni pubbliche, nelle deposizioni, nelle traslazioni, nelle processioni, sono esposti e fruibili, almeno sul piano visivo. Sono oggetti che in alcuni casi forniscono uno straordinario spaccato sui contatti tra aree anche molto lontane, attraverso il Mediterraneo e l'Europa settentrionale, e testimoniano una mobilità viva dai circuiti di pellegrinaggio fino ai donativi di alto livello. Spesso non è possibile ricostruire i contesti di produzione né quelli d'uso dei reliquiari, ma essi sono frequentemente protagonisti di un terzo tipo di contesto, cioè quello di trasmissione. Molti reliquiari, quando non completamente dispersi o finiti in un anonimo mercato antiquario, da cui poi a volte i musei li hanno acquisiti, sono pervenuti all'interno di raccolte particolari, i cosiddetti tesori delle cattedrali e dei monasteri. La ricostruzione delle vicende di formazione di queste collezioni e della progressiva acquisizione di reliquiari talvolta è molto difficile, anzi spesso è molto difficile, ma è anche questo un capitolo molto seducente nella comprensione della lunga vita di un reliquiario che si dipana attraverso i secoli. Nel nostro convegno emergeranno naturalmente moltissimi altri spunti, penso anche solo a tutto il discorso delle decorazioni e dei loro molteplici significati. L'areale che approfondiremo è molto vasto, ma l'idea era proprio quella di mettere a confronto territori e spazi culturali differenti, eppure molto spesso in profonda interazione fra loro. Altre aree geografiche restano certamente da approfondire, ma l'intento di questo incontro non è un'impossibile esaustività, quanto la messa in dialogo di esperienze, di conoscenze, di studi che possano apportare un ulteriore contributo alla ricerca. Non mi resta quindi a questo punto che augurare a tutti un buon lavoro e lascio allora nuovamente la parola al nostro Presidente per la prosecuzione della giornata. Grazie.
Grazie a lei Eleonora, grazie per questa produzione del tutto chiarente che ci ha dato un'idea giusta dell'ampiezza delle implicazioni di questo incontro. Allora adesso j'appelle donc Alain Dubroc, qui est le premier intervenant, Alain Dubroc de l'Université de Lyon 3, qui va nous parler des reliquaires et de leur rôle à travers les sources écrites. À toi, Alain.
Bon. Est-ce qu'on m'entend?
Oui, oui, oui.
On m'entend correctement? Bon, très bien. Merci Jean-Pierre et merci Eleonora de m'avoir invité à ce colloque et de m'avoir accordé le redoutable privilège de faire la première communication, qui sera forcément généraliste et qui ne s'occupera que des sources écrites. Il n'est donc aucune photo dans mon PowerPoint d'objet. Il n'y aura que des citations. Les reliquaires sont un objet d'étude relativement récent, si l'on accepte le monumental travail de Joseph Brown en 1940, dont Eleonora a parlé. D'ailleurs, je te remercie parce que ça m'évite de reprendre la bibliographie du thème. Je citerai simplement plus récemment donc l'article d'Alain Dirkens, un article fondamental paru dans le colloque Les Relics, organisé par Edina Bozzocchi et Cécile Trefort en 1999, qui met les reliquaires en relation avec la liturgie et la politique, suivi du colloque allemand Reliquari et Mittelalter de Bruno Freudenbach en 2005, qui s'occupe de la période du Moyen-Âge central, et les travaux d'Edina Bozzocchi et de Philippe Georges. Enfin, on a déjà fait les travaux plus récents de Cynthia Hahn, en particulier sa thèse éditée sous le nom de Strange Beauty, et bien sûr les travaux de nos collègues réunis dans ce présent colloque. Tous ces travaux portent essentiellement sur l'histoire de l'art et l'archéologie, mais les sources écrites ont beaucoup à dire aussi sur les reliquaires. Ce sont des sources variées, juridiques, littéraires, narratives ou hagiographiques, sermons ou inventaires de reliques comme un sarrique. Il faut noter que paradoxalement, on trouve très peu d'informations dans le Liber Pontificalis. Mais il y en a quand même quelques-unes. Les sources donnent des informations sur la justification des reliquaires, leur ornementation et leurs usages. Je vais donc intervenir en 3 parties. D'abord, le vocabulaire et son évolution. Ensuite, la justification théologique des reliquaires. Et en 3e lieu, à quoi servent de manière pratique les reliques. Pour ce qui est du vocabulaire, le vocabulaire évolue avec la conception des reliques selon le temps. Reliquiae en latin signifiait les restes d'un mort, mais a pris un sens plus spécifiquement chrétien à la fin du IVe siècle chez Victrice de Rouen. Diapo. Donc, pour Victrice, la relique, c'est le sang des martyrs et le limon de leur tombe, mais qui équivaut au corps dans sa totalité, comme on le voit dans la citation que vous avez à l'écran. On utilise les termes de reliquiae, corpus ou même bras indifféremment dès le 5e siècle. Et il faut noter aussi que les sources du Moyen-Âge ne font pas de différence entre reliques réelles et reliques représentatives. À partir du VIe siècle se développe l'usage des mots pineres et surtout pignora, donc qui ont une origine juridique. Je rappelle que pignus, c'est le gage, donc la garantie au niveau chrétien de la virtus du saint à travers ses reliques, comme on le trouve dans la Vita Hilari. Le terme de reliquaire, quant à lui, est tardif. Reliquiarium apparaît dans des sources françaises au XIVe et XVe siècle. La première occurrence, c'est l'inventaire des cordeliers d'Avignon en 1350. À haute époque, les termes utilisés sont plutôt vas, vasculum, mais surtout capsa et phylacterio. Vas et vasculum apparaissent fréquemment chez Grégoire de Tours, donc dans le Ingloria Martyrum, dans le sens de tombeau, car au départ, le tombeau lui-même est considéré comme un reliquaire. On trouve aussi des reliquaires en forme de sarcophage, comme on l'a vu dans la communication d'Éléonore. Selon Brown, ce n'est qu'à partir du XIIe siècle qu'il désigne un reliquaire. En fait, une source du tout début du VIe siècle, la vie des pères du Jura, le comprend déjà dans ce sens. Diapo 3. Vous voyez dans cette citation que le terme utilisé est donc wascula, reliquiarum wasculi. Et on voit aussi que ces reliquaires vont être inclus sous l'autel et qu'on affirme en même temps, le diapo suivant, voilà la traduction française, on indique que la gloire et les mérites des saints ne peuvent être contenus dans les limites d'un lieu quelconque. Vas ou vasculum peut avoir le sens de cercueil ou de sarcophage, mais ici on voit deux moines qui rapportent à pied les reliques, donc il s'agit d'un reliquaire portable. On constate qu'il y a déjà aussi un rituel liturgique et que les reliquaires sont placés sous l'autel, qui devient lui-même un reliquaire. Nous avons ici trois saints, donc trois reliquaires. Le symbole trinitaire est évident, mais on voit aussi, avec le mot que j'ai mis en gras de localitaire, le problème de l'illocalitas. C'est-à-dire, est-ce que les saints, est-ce que la virtus des saints se limite au tombeau ou est-ce qu'elle s'applique également partout? Et c'est une justification aussi théologique de la fragmentation des cultes. Déjà, un sermon de Saint Jérôme contre Vigilance affirmait que les saints sont présents partout, y compris hors de leur tombeau. Cette affirmation comporte un danger que l'on va voir à l'époque carolingienne, parce que si les saints sont efficaces partout et leurs reliques efficaces partout, les pèlerinages sont inutiles. C'est l'avis de Claude de Turin, donc évêque de Turin au IXe siècle sous Louis. Le terme de TK, quant à lui, n'apparaît pas avant l'époque carolingienne dans le sens de contenant de reliques. On le trouve pour la première fois dans les Carmina 79 et 84 de Raban-Mort, mais surtout à partir du XIe siècle. Phylacterium existait déjà dans le monde gréco-romain, dans le sens d'une petite boîte pendue au cou, contre la magie et la sorcellerie. Elle prend le sens chrétien de reliquaire portatif, déjà chez Grégoire le Grand, qui offre au roi d'Alvald un phylactère contenant un morceau de la croix, et dans sa lettre à la reine des Lombards, Théodélie. Mais ce terme se diffuse vraiment à partir du IXe siècle, avec la vie de Grégoire, de Jean Diacre, ou le testament d'Eberhard de Friot. Le mot arca, dans les sources du Haut Moyen-Âge, désigne le plus souvent un sarcophage, lui aussi, mais prend le sens de reliquaire à l'époque carolingienne. Raban-Mort, dans le Carmen 99, donc De Reliquis in eadem arca positis, en est peut-être la première occurrence. On le trouve aussi dans l'inventaire de la cathédrale de Clermont au Xe siècle. Le terme le plus utilisé est cependant celui de capsa, dès le VIe siècle. Grégoire de Tours en fait 6 occurrences dans Ingloria Martyrum. On le trouve aussi dans les De Virtutibus Sancti Juliani et les Vitae Patrum. Mais on le trouve aussi dans les miracles de Saint-Étienne. Diapo. Vous voyez donc dans cette citation qu'il y a une capsella, c'est-à-dire une petite capsa, une petite chasse en argent, où était une portion des reliques. On indique bien qu'il s'agit d'une partie des reliques des saints, ce qui montre bien la fragmentation. Ce terme se généralise à l'époque carolingienne, avec l'inventaire de Centulas, Sariquier, en 800 et celui de 831. On le trouve aussi dans les Modicios Synodalis ou dans les Capitula d'Akmar ou le Testament Eberhard. Ce terme pouvait à l'occasion désigner une sorte de phylactère ou de reliquaire portable. Ainsi, dans la vie de Saint-Germain d'Auxerre, par Constance de Lyon, on voit que le saint portait toujours sur lui une capsula qui contenait des reliques de plusieurs saints. De même, la vie de saint Amâtre par Étienne l'Africain précise que le saint portait au cou un capsellaris honor. À noter une occurrence un peu plus étrange du mot capsa dans les 10 livres d'histoire de Grégoire de Tours, dans le livre 7, 31. L'évêque Bertrand de Bordeaux découvre une capsa pendue le long de la paroi de l'autel, contenant l'os du doigt de Saint-Serge. C'était donc une chasse extérieure à l'autel et pendue à l'autel, peut-être dans une pochette, comme on en trouve à Saculum, peut-être, comme on en trouve en Irlande ou ailleurs. En tous les cas, le reliquaire est souvent associé à l'autel et il peut être inséré dans un loculus, comme Éléonora l'a dit, l'autel devenant lui-même un reliquaire. L'inventaire de Saint-Riquier, en 1831, mentionne 30 faces d'argent, d'or ou d'ivoire. Ces reliquaires sont donc magnifiquement ornés, surtout à partir de l'époque carolingienne. Ainsi, diapo 6, on trouve donc on trouve dans la chronique des abbés de Fontenelle, dans la geste de l'abbé Hugues, il légua un coffret d'or et de pierreries contenant des reliques de plusieurs saints. Donc, deux choses, le coffret contient plusieurs reliques, il est orné d'or et de pierreries. Ce qui m'amène à la justification théologique de l'ornementation de ces coffrets. À très haute époque, on trouve une justification dans le De Laude Sanctorum de Victrice de Rouen. C'est un sermon prononcé par Victrice en 396 à l'occasion de la réception des reliques de saint Ambroise. Les reliques du saint font un adventus royal et Victrice justifie l'ornementation des reliquaires qui ne sont pas là pour leur propre beauté, mais parce que les saints irradient la lumière du Christ. Diapo suivant. Donc, on voit bien le vêtement de la lumière éternelle, la pourpre royale, il y a toujours une comparaison avec la royauté, les diadèmes ornés des lumières variées des joyaux de la princesse, ce sont donc toutes les vertus, exprimées chacune dans une propre pierre. Voici que le sauveur artisan, encore un nouveau concept, a orné les couronnes des martyrs de joyaux spirituels. On voit donc bien que les reliquaires doivent être ornés d'or, d'argent ou de pierres précieuses qui mettent en valeur les vertus du saint. Paulin de Nol a la même position. Diapo suivante. Un texte un peu plus étrange, celui de Fortuna, qui me pose des questions. Dans la vie de Saint Martin, chapitre 4, on nous décrit la main de Saint Martin, qui brille d'une clarté céleste, l'éclat varié des pierres précieuses, les reflets de lumière. De ses bras jaillissaient les rouges éclairs des pierres qui étincelaient, et Arborius, le comte, atteste qu'il entendit le cliquetis des pierres entrechaussées. Ce texte montre bien la relation entre la virtus du saint, l'or et les pierres précieuses qui manifestent cette virtu. Peut-être peut-on y voir aussi la description d'un reliquaire orné contenant les reliques de Saint Martin. Dans ce cas, il s'agirait selon moi d'une première préfiguration du bras reliquaire, ce qui pose problème puisque, d'après Braun, le Haut Moyen-Âge n'a pas connu de bras reliquaire. La première occurrence, selon lui, s'en trouve dans la chronique de Flavigny au XIe siècle. Le reliquaire en forme de main apparaît quant à lui un peu plus tôt, au début du IXe siècle, dans les miracles de Saint-Denis. Le doigt de Saint-Denis dans une main reliquaire en or. Donc ça, je vous pose le problème. Je pense qu'on a la description de la relique. Autre information, les saints réunis dans un même reliquaire travaillent ensemble. C'est une notion que l'on trouve chez Paulin de Nol, et Grégoire de Tours, et l'idée d'une communauté agissante des saints, une sorte de course céleste. Les saints œuvrent ensemble contre les démons. D'où la pratique de rassembler plusieurs reliques dans un reliquaire, augmentant ainsi l'efficacité de la virtus des saints. On trouve ainsi une grande quantité de reliques dans les reliquaires dans Gilbert, et Raban-Mort s'est fabriqué en 835 un reliquaire qui imite explicitement l'Arche d'Alliance. Dans cette nouvelle arche, utilisée dans les processions, il dépose 7 reliques de saints et 8 autres l'année suivante. Bodonivi, la moniale, raconte aussi que saint Radegonde voulait faire une collection de reliques qui culmine bien sûr avec celle de la Sainte. Le reliquaire cache les reliques, il les protège, il les protège des regards profanes et en même temps il les montre et les met en scène. La sauvegarde des reliques est donc un thème, mais ces reliques se retrouvent aussi sous le contrôle ecclésiastique. Diapo suivante. La chronique des abbés de Fontenelle, chapitre 10, l'abbé Ostolf. Donc on nous montre ici, donc diapo suivante, en français. Voilà, la traduction française. Donc on voit arriver sur les eaux, nous sommes en Normandie, une sorte de bateau ressemblant à un petit phare. Ce bateau, étant approché, on l'ouvre et regardant à l'intérieur, on découvre un très beau livre contenant les 4 évangiles, écrits en oncial, et un coffre. Dans ce coffret, on découvre un morceau de la mâchoire du martyr Georges, ainsi que plusieurs autres reliques de divers saints, dont du bois de la croix du Sauveur. Et on nous précise, tout cela a été expliqué en détail dans ce reliquaire, par écrit, ce qui montre qu'il y avait un authentique de relique dans ce reliquaire. On a donc ici un phare reliquaire contenant un autre reliquaire et les évangiles. Diapo suivante, c'est la suite du texte, la geste de Ostrus. Ayant ensuite promulgué un jeûne, donc on prépare un chariot, on dit transfère le reliquaire et 2 vaches sont attelées au chariot qui va partir sans guide et sous la conduite d'aucun vacher au lieu appelé Brique jusqu'à maintenant. Alors c'est intéressant parce que on a vu une allusion à l'Arche d'Alliance, naturellement, dans ce chariot qui va tout seul avec ses reliques. On trouve ce thème aussi dans les gîtes saints irlandais et bretons. Diapo suivante. On arrive à la description de ce phare qui est en fait une tour reliquaire. Diapo suivante pour la traduction française. Voilà. C'est pour l'avoir vu que j'ai décrit la forme de cette tour où étaient disposées les reliques. Carré, donc je vous laisse lire la description, je ne vais pas la relire, mais on voit qu'en son milieu se trouvait une autre niche où étaient conservés l'évangéliaire et le relique. C'est quelque chose d'intéressant parce qu'on a, à mon avis, un des premiers exemples de ces tours reliquaires. L'auteur de la Vita se demande d'où vient cette tour reliquaire. Et il nous dit que le pape Zacharie, 83e pape au temps de Pépin le Bref, a découvert à Rome dans une chasse le très saint chef du bienheureux martyr Georges, avec à l'intérieur une tablette écrite cette fois en caractère grec, qui signifiait que c'était bien lui. Le narrateur croit que des Bretons séjournant à Rome avaient reçu du pape des reliques de Saint Georges, puis les avaient perdues en mer, et elles arrivent miraculeusement en Normandie. Et il est absolument sûr que l'évangéliaire a été écrit à Rome. Et immédiatement après, il met cette découverte en rapport avec le diplôme d'immunité donné par Pépin en faveur du monastère. C'est donc le reliquaire qui entraîne le privilège. C'est un peu... La simple présence de cette tour reliquaire me pose problème, parce que si l'on en croit Brown, la première tour de relique connue est celle de l'abbatiale de Conques, documentée par une inscription de l'abbé Bégaud, c'est-à-dire au XIe siècle. Elles sont rares jusqu'au XIVe siècle, et ici, donc, on en a 2 siècles avant. Diapo suivante. Donc, toujours la geste des évêques, des abbés de Fontenelle, la geste vite laïque, 754-787, qui a légué au patrimoine de son église un coffret en or et en argent, rehaussé de pierreries, qu'il avait fait fabriquer pour l'évangile. Il s'agit naturellement de l'évangéliaire dont on a parlé à l'instant, qui était contenu dans cette tour. Cette fois-ci, il aura un coffret en or et en argent. Et ceci confirme la théorie de Paul Handel sur la rénovation qui est absolument nécessaire des reliques. Quand le reliquaire n'est plus assez luxueux, il faut le rénover. Et c'est un peu dans ce cadre aussi, dans le cadre de la rénovation carmélienne, qu'on peut situer cette rénovation des reliques. Ce qui m'amène au 3e point, le contexte politique et religieux. J'ai presque fini. Comme les reliques, les reliquaires constituent aussi un enjeu de pouvoir. Comme l'a montré Alain Dirkens, ils ont une grande importance politique et religieuse à l'époque carolingienne. Diapo suivante. À partir du milieu du 8e siècle, elles ont une fonction de soutien du royaume et du peuple franc, comme l'a montré Edina Bozoki. On a ainsi le préambule de la loi salique, où l'on voit donc ces reliquaires ornés d'or, de pierres précieuses, qui protègent le royaume et qui protègent le peuple franc. C'est donc une alliance du culte des reliques et de l'exaltation du royaume, liée par l'ornementation des reliques. Autre point, les reliquaires servent à la christianisation et la prise en main politique de nouveaux territoires par la translation solennelle de reliques contenues dans des reliques. À partir de l'époque carolingienne, toute construction d'église ou d'hôtel implique le dépôt de reliques. C'est le capitulaire de Charlemagne en 1901. D'où un développement du trafic et de vol de reliques presque institutionnalisé si l'on en croit la translation de Saint-Pierre et Martin par Régina. Et ces translations ont été très tôt réglementées, sous Louis le Pieux, par le canon 51 du Concile de Mayence en 830. Le contrôle se fait par le souverain et l'évêque du lieu. L'exemple typique, c'est la translation des reliques de Saint-Hubert dans la Vita Secunda de Sancti Uberti, rédigée par l'évêque Jonas d'Orléans, proche de l'empereur et l'inspirateur de ces grands conciles réformateurs de 829 et 830. Dans son récit de la translation en 825, il expose une procédure type. L'évêque de Liège, Falco, demande à son supérieur, l'archevêque de Cologne, Hildebolde, l'autorisation du transfert. Celui-ci en réfère à l'empereur et la décision finale est prise en conseil. Après quoi se situe un rituel de la translation de l'église Saint-Pierre de Liège au monastère nouvellement restauré d'Andage, dans les Ardennes. Le transport se fait d'abord dans le sarcophage originel, puis les reliques sont déposées dans une casse, induisant une bipolarisation du culte, à la fois sur Liège et sur les Ardennes, et permettant une meilleure christianisation des Ardennes, mais le culte persiste à Liège, où l'on vénère l'évêque comme un saint évêque bâtisseur carolin. Tout le récit tend à en faire un miroir de l'évêque et de la sainteté épiscopale, et insiste sur la prise en charge de la société chrétienne par l'épiscopat. À noter qu'une première translation du corps de Saint-Hubert avait eu lieu en 743 sous la direction du princeps Carloman, qui se saisit lui-même des reliques de Saint-Hubert qu'il déposa sur un brancard, ce qui pose le problème du contact direct des laïcs avec les saintes reliques, en principe interdit. Mais cette interdiction est largement négligée, et il faut dire que le princeps n'est pas un laïc ordinaire. Un peu plus tard, on trouve sur le même thème la translation du Saint-Vie, et aussi celle de Saint-Liboire du Mans à Paderborn en 836. Diapo, c'est le chapitre 11. Le départ du Mans jusqu'à la sortie de la ville se fait sous la direction de l'évêque Aldric, un autre très proche de Louis le Pieux, avec un rituel très codifié. Une célébration de la messe d'abord, puis vous avez le texte qui apparaît à l'écran, où le clergé revêt les ornements ecclésiastiques, le brancard est hissé sur les épaules des prêtres, avec le son des cloches et les étendards de la croix sainte et visitante, ainsi que les livres des saints évangiles. Là aussi, l'association du reliquaire et des évangiles est, à mon avis, fondamentale. L'association des saints évangiles au reliques. Comme certains habitants du Mans s'alarmaient de perdre leur saint protecteur, l'évêque leur répondit que Dieu avait autorisé la translation pour amener à la foi un peuple récemment conquis et que c'était un ordre de l'empereur. Je cite, « Il faut aussi qu'on sache que le sérénissime empereur Louis a ordonné de le faire. Or, quiconque résiste à son autorité résiste à un ordre de Dieu. » Cette citation de l'Épître aux Romains 13, typique de la conception eusébienne du pouvoir impérial qui a présidé au règne de Louis le Pieux, montre bien l'importance de l'enjeu politique de la translation et l'extension de l'Empire carolingien et la pacification des territoires occupés. Autre enjeu, c'est mon dernier point, les processions solennelles de reliques pour soutenir les revendications des églises et abbayes ou obtenir justice. Le schéma est type. Après une spoliation, le reliquaire du saint est amené en présence de l'usurpateur ou du juge. c'est un phénomène du Xe siècle. Le meilleur exemple est celui des Miracula Columbani, les miracles de Saint-Colomban, bien étudiés par François Bougard et édités récemment en 2010. Les moines de Bobbio, victimes des usurpations de biens de leurs voisins, laïcs et ecclésiastiques, élèvent solennellement les reliques du saint avec leur abbé, les placent dans une arche, cette fois-ci c'est le terme de arca qui est utilisé, et font en possession le tour des domaines monastiques, ce qui ressemble un peu à le entourage irlandais. Puis se rendent à Pavie au tribunal du roi. S'ensuit un véritable jugement de Dieu avec serment sur les reliques de Saint-Colomban. Il faut noter que cette arca devait être placée en hauteur, certainement sur un brancard, puisque les malades pouvaient passer en dessous. De même, une femme qui arracha avec les dents un morceau de la chasse du saint et en fut punie par une mort immédiate. Le narrateur conclut cet épisode en disant que les femmes se disaient entre elles « Saint-Colomban ne veut pas que nous nous approchions de sa chasse ». Cette dernière précision évoque un problème récurrent du Haut Moyen-Âge, l'accès des femmes aux saintes reliques est-il permis? La victoire des moines de Bobbio donna l'impulsion à d'autres processions de revendication. Ainsi, en 944, les chanoines de Maastricht transportent à Duisbourg la chasse de Saint-Servais pour demander la protection d'Othon Ier contre les intrusions du comte du lieu. Et en 960, les moines de Luxeuil emmènent les reliques de Saint-Valbert, l'abbé réformateur, pour réclamer la restitution d'une villa du monastère spoliée par un certain Robert. En conclusion, les reliquaires se trouvent dans les sources médiévales sous plusieurs appellations, allant du sarcophage reliquaire au phylactère, en passant par la chasse et le loculus de l'autel. Ils semblent cumuler plusieurs fonctions. Une fonction symbolique, manifester la lumière divine, d'où l'importance de leur ornementation en métaux précieux et en pierreries, et exalter la virtus du saint. Ils constituent aussi une médiation entre la relique et le spectateur, en assumant un double rôle, protéger les reliques du contact des personnes non autorisées, mais aussi montrer, mettre en scène la sainteté. Leur fonction est aussi liturgique, comme on le voit dans les processions, en particulier les rogations. Mais à partir de l'époque carolingienne, leur usage et leur translation sont soigneusement codifiés et la législation vise à accroître le pouvoir de la hiérarchie épiscopale sur la sainteté, tout en ménageant et en glorifiant le pouvoir royal. Au Xe siècle, un nouvel usage politique se développe à partir de Bobbio, autour des abbés des grands monastères, qui voient dans les possessions de reliques un moyen de récupérer des biens spoliés par l'Église. À la même époque, avec l'essor des principautés, les privilèges royaux furent repris par ces mêmes groupes. Je vous remercie.
Merci Alain pour cette communication très riche. Il était tout à fait fondamental qu'elle intervienne au début du colloque dans la mesure où malheureusement les objets qui nous sont parvenus ne disent pas tout quant à leurs usages et à leur signification dans le contexte de l'époque même dans laquelle ils ont été conçus, et ce sont les textes évidemment qui permettent de saisir bien des choses. Vorrei subito ricordare due cose per i seguenti relatori. Al più possibile dobbiamo mantenere i tempi previsti, dunque non oltre 15 minuti, perché altrimenti non so a che ora finiremo stasera. Dunque un quarto d'ora, vi prego tutti. Seconda cosa, ci sarà una discussione dopo la prima metà di questa sessione, dunque la discussione avrà luogo subito dopo la relazione di Jörg Drauschke. Avete già la possibilità, mentre i relatori parlano, di scrivere le vostre eventuali domande. Si verranno queste domande sullo schermo e poi si potrà economizzare un po' di tempo per iniziare la discussione. Grazie in anticipo. Now I invite our colleague Dieter Quast from the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum to deliver his communication, which is intitulated Reliquaries and Archaeology, Research and Methodological Approaches from Late Antiquity to Early Medieval Period. Please, dear colleague.
I'm sorry, but Eleonora held nearly all my lecture I have when she was speaking, so maybe I can reduce it really to 50 minutes. So next slide, please, Eleonora. So many disciplines are working with reliquaries. You see, I think most of them noticed on this paper, and only in working together we can bring the best results for working with reliquaries. Anyway, sometimes it's useful to see what is a part of their own discipline to make a stock check of what archaeology can do with reliquaries. I will try to do it, even if 15 minutes are a very, very short frame, but I try to do it. Next slide, please. I ask myself, what were the main questions we all posed while working with reliquaries? And those are the ecclesiastical networks, and on the contrary, the regionality of working in ecclesiastical not networks, but communities, and the ritual practice, which include a lot of things that I will show you on the next slide. If you ask for, next slide, please. If you ask for the archaeological question, how we can work with, how we can answer to ecclesiastical networks and ritual praxis, we can try to analyze chronology and dissemination of reliquaries and relics, and also the production and use, which includes the image program, the material, the color of the objects, and often of the gemstones used for, and also the gem allegories. The questions the archaeology is able to pose is: when was the reliquary produced? How long was it used? How was it produced? For what was it produced? Where was it detected? And where it was produced? Please, the next slide, please. There we will start with the question when it was produced and how long it was used. We have in late antiquity and especially in the early medieval period a very fine system of chronology, and this belongs to a lot of furnished graves. We have 10,000 to 40,000 furnished graves, burials from the early medieval period, which can be ordered by simple statistics to a chronological framework. And we have this framework up to now to a level of 30 years. This is not exactly 30 years, you know it, it's around 30 years, a level of one generation. And this allows us to make a very fine chronology, especially for the late 5th to the mid 8th century. You see on the left side a map of so-called row graves. These are large cemeteries with hundreds or thousands of graves, of furnished graves, which are the basic for our chronology. And you see on the left side for the Viking period, so for the 9th to the 11th century, a similar system for chronology, which is based on styles. Most of them are animal styles that were used for the dating of this. We can use this because, on the next slide, please, you can see that the same style or the same decoration that was used for sword fittings, for brooches, for belt buckles, and so on, was also used on early reliquaries. You see on the left side the so-called Valbertus reliquary from Beron Münster in Switzerland, which is dated to the second half of the 7th century because of the animal style you can see under the reliquary, which is a typical late animal style too. We can date to the last third of the 7th century, and this fits very well to the to the information given by an inscription that the sponsor of this was Warenbert, who was maybe an episcope of Soissons and who died in the 670s. On the right side, you see a small reliquary from southwest Germany, which was decorated with stamps which were not produced exactly, or in my opinion, were not produced exactly for this reliquary, but were used also for other things, and they were used because they were there when the reliquary was produced, and they were used to construct an image program. The next slide, please. So you can see how long reliquaries were produced, because some of them has repairs, like this one from Chur in Switzerland, and you see on the left side, the back side of the small reliquary, and you see a repair on the upper side. The reliquary is made in the early 8th century. We can date it by the decoration again. And also the colleagues made a dendrochronological analysis of this, which is unfortunately not published. And I was never able to get it, but it's said to be early 8th century. The reliquary is produced of spruce wood and covered with sheets of gilded copper. And you see in the red rectangular a repair from the 12th century made with a complete different decoration. And we see how long this reliquary must be really in use, that it was broken and repaired again. Please, the next slide. And you can see, if we go back from chronology, which is really a typical archaeological topic, we will go to regionality, and I show you just two distribution maps to see how archaeology can work with this. On the left side, you see the small reliquaries. We call them travel reliquaries. They were carried maybe around processions or while traveling, and you see they were in northern Italy, Switzerland, France, and in the insular world only, while on the right map you see small silver reliquaries found in altars, which were only part of the eastern Mediterranean. They were up to northern Italy in the Alps, but they seem to lack completely in France in the Merovingian Empire. The next slide, please. Also for regionality, we can use the style, because the style is typical bound to special regions. The late animal style 2 I showed you already is part of the Merovingian Empire, but on the underside of this reliquary there's a complete different ornamentation, which is a Mediterranean one, maybe an Eastern Mediterranean one, and this fits absolutely not to this animal style one. So archaeologists have long discussed where this reliquary was produced. Patrick Perrin thought it was in northern Italy or in the Lombard region. Victor Elban thought it was in Burgund. So it may be some region where this Mediterranean world and the Frankish or the Merovingian realms found together were lying next to each other. Next slide, please. We'll show you some of these so-called insular reliquaries, which were known from Ireland, of course. This is not surprising. Some of them as maybe Viking booty from Scandinavia. And we have also a few of them in northern Italy. You know, the one from Bobbio, of course, and the one from Bologna. And on the slide, you can see a brand new one. This means it's not brand new. It was bought for the Berlin Museum at the end of the 19th century, but it was never published. But you see a hinge of such an insular reliquary that was found or it was said to found in Rome, and it has also an patina that it was really a find which was excavated. Next slide, please. So if we talk about reliquaries, we have to get in mind that we will talk about relics as well. And in the early medieval period, not only there, we have different classifications of relics. I used one which is very popular in Germany, and it's divided in first class relics, which were parts of the body of a saint or the body of a saint. Second class relics, which were in touch with a saint or during his lifetime, and the third class relics, which were in touch with first class or second class relics. And this is a majority of relics we deal with, I'm sure, with this third class relics. And you can see on the next slide how you can produce them. We find on pilgrim, on places for pilgrims, we found reliquaries to produce this third class reliquaries. You find here two objects to sarcophagus like reliquaries from Syria, and you see under the number 1 a hole where you can fill in some oil that is running around the content of the sarcophag of the reliquary, and you can put it out at the number 2, and then it was in touch with the relics, and it was this third class relics you have there. You can put this oil in a pilgrim flask like the ones Eleonora showed, and take it at home. On the written sources give us other information, but we can do it in discussion, not now. I want to focus a little bit on archaeology. The next slide I will go to image and ornament. Even there we have a division between Eastern and Eastern Mediterranean region and the Merovingian empires. In the Eastern Mediterranean region, we have often these silver reliquaries with figural decoration with the image of Christ or the Trinity or holy saints. This is more or less rare in the Frankish Empire. It comes here at the late of the 7th century. We have a few examples like the reliquary, the small reliquary on the right side without provenance, which is now in the Museum of Cluny, which is dated or seemed to be dated to the early 8th century. On the next slide, you see how ornament from the Eastern Mediterranean or from the Mediterranean part was transformed into, it's not really animal style, but it's a sort of animal style. You see a reliquary from Anger. It's a small box like this. The show side is covered by gemstones, and you can see on the right side some animals which were in a fish and a bird and a worm, and maybe these are the Tria Genera Animatium, which were transformed from the Mediterranean world into an image language of the Frankish Empire. You can, unfortunately, I cannot show them to you, but Eleonora, do you see them and couldn't show them?
Sorry.
Can you show the animals? If not, you have to trust me that they are there on the show side. Please go on. Please go on to the next slide, please. Yes, if we go to the different functions and to the different forms of the reliquaries, we can order them by forms, but I think I won't do it. It's not that interesting. We can divide them by the form of use. We have altar reliquaries, which were immobile, deposited in a reliquary. We have travel reliquaries, which were used while traveling or use it on processions, and house reliquaries, which were known from written sources that they have been there, not in a church, but at home, and were used there. Next slide, please. You can see some examples for this altar reliquaries. Eleonora has shown them already. On the left side, the feature of Seben from the Southern Church, and then you see some examples from buff from Canzianiberg in Austria, and a buff from Janava Tepe near Varna, the golden one which was put into the silver one into the marble one. All Eleonora showed them already. The next slide shows you something very typical. This is that reliquaries from rural churches in the Frankish or Merovingian Empire were absolutely untypical containers. So they often have not a typical form. You can use glass vessels for it. You can use small boxes of bone or antler, like you can see there. And yes, of bone there too. These boxes were not only used as reliquaries. We have them always in normal settlements where they were used, yes, the bottles as drinking equipment, and the antler and bone boxes as boxes for jewelry or something else. So they use something, what they have to use it as a reliquary and put the relics in. The next slide shows you something which also Eleonora has shown already, that we have next to this, let's say, official reliquaries, we have private ones, which makes it sometimes, of course, very difficult to see if it's a relic or if it's an amulet in a pagan way. But this is something to discuss. We have these buckles with small boxes in where we can find hairs or wax in, or amulet boxes, or even this strap end which has a lid that you can open and there was wax in. And you see also a gold foil cross, which I don't want to go in detail, but I think it's something to mark a third-class relic in a private grave. The next slide, please. Yes, only to go away from archaeology, 2 slides. We are looking, of course, of depictions of the objects. Eleonora has also shown this wonderful stone from Peppel from the Shetland Islands, and with a much nicer photo than mine old one. But you see monks with containers wearing on their necks. Maybe those were travel reliquaries, but it's also possible that those were satchels for books only. We cannot say it. On the right side, it's much better to see. You have the collection of reliquaries from Echternach in Luxembourg. And this is a miniature of the early 12th century, and hanging from the ceiling, you see some small reliquaries which were depicted perfectly like the small early medieval reliquaries we found in archaeological context, or, to be honest, much more often in church treasures. But you can see how long they were used and how they were used, and of course it's not surprising that these reliquaries were not thrown away but used in church treasures as well all the time. The next slide shows you something, the combination between artifact and text. Alain Dubec have told a lot of reliquaries in written sources. I have here some terms that were used in the Latin sources: Chrismarium, Capsula, Reliquias, Vasculi. I did forget to mention ein Minister, a term from Irish sources which was detected by Ragnall of Flyn as a meaning of small reliquaries. The next slide, please, is the last one, and I will end up my short gallop through archaeology and reliquaries, and I hope I could give you a very small overview of it. A lot of this was only on a very banal, low level of information, but maybe it's a good point of discussion. Thank you very much for your audience, and Eleonora, thank you very much for showing my PowerPoint.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Cast, for this presentation, which has raised some essential problems. One which hasn't yet been because the time of using these reliquaries, perhaps we will have the opportunity to go back to this very important problem too. So now I think we are, everything is in order to listen to Jörg Drauschke. Please,
okay.
Let's go now.
Thank you very much again. And the next IT expert from Mainz will try to show, his presentation. Do you see my presentation now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Wow, yeah. Thanks again, and sorry that it didn't work the last time, but I'm now without any rest. I will go on with my presentation for you. The next 15 minutes, I'm going to speak about the phenomenon of saints and relics from the East. By this, I mean an origin around the Eastern Mediterranean, that were venerated in late antique and early medieval Gaul. In contrast to the original title of my paper, I had to drop my outlook to the Carolingian time due to the short presentation time, and will only focus the 5th up to the 7th, 8th century. My research in this topic was framed by an interdisciplinary working group hosted by our cooperation Byzantium between Orient and Occident here in Mainz. I focused mainly on the questions which proofs for Eastern saints and relics in the West exist at all, and under which circumstances they have been disseminated in Francia, which persons had been involved in the exchange process. What can we learn about the connection between the Franks and the East, especially the Byzantine Empire? I also asked for the impact the relics had for the church, parish, or region they had been transferred to. So in the end, my paper is more about saints and relics than about the reliquaries themselves, because we hardly have any evidence for Eastern reliquaries of this age in the West. And I begin with a very, very short overview about saints and relics from late Roman to Merovingian Gaul. We all know that the veneration of martyrs and saints started more or less in the 2nd century AD, and that first translationes have been accomplished already around the middle of the 4th century. Following Brigitte Beaujard and her large-scale study on the cult of saints in Gaul, the veneration of martyrs and saints developed there later than in Italy, North Africa, or the Roman East. She only wants to estimate the time before around 400 AD as the prehistory of the cult of martyrs in Gaul, with some few trendsetters like the bishops Martin and Victor of Rouen. Until the middle of the 5th century, this new form of Christian cult practice grew more and more in importance, and during the 2nd half of the 5th century, when the institutions of the public administration vanished, and the bishops in the cities of Gaul more and more took over the roles as their heads, the relics of saints and of Gallic martyrs even grew in their importance, especially as defenders of the particular civitatis. The last decades of the 5th century, after the end of the West Roman Empire and the concurrent end of the Alia, then was a time of uncertainties with different players in Gaul that more or less ended around the century, the supremacy of the Frankish Merovingians. The cults were not only by them, but also by the royal families of the other gentes in their territories, so that the cults had become an integral part of the political life. This development was also a result of the bishops' activities, as the raise of the saints' importance was in the center of their action during the whole 6th century, and it was also driven by the strategies of the nobility and the religious needs of the faithful. This particular attitude of the cult of saints, especially from the 6th century onwards, certainly distinguished Frankish Christianity from other Christian regions. Bordeaux counts more than 120 names of saints from Gaul that appear for the first time in the written record of the 6th century. Of course, most of the indigenous saints were only important on a local level. I come now to the core subject, the veneration of Eastern saints and relics, and I begin with the evidence. Given the numerous local Gaulish saints and the distribution of their cults, it seems inevitably that foreign saints are more seldom to be. The following examples are collected based on the written record of the 5th until the 8th century and contain mainly information from Gregory of Tours and other sources like, for example, Venantius Fortunatus. Several churches with Eastern patrons are mentioned there, but in most cases it is not clear. Churches also possessed the corresponding relics, although this was obviously expected by the public in the 6th century at the latest. Earlier evidence of relics from Eastern saints definitely exists, but remains sparse. Victricius of Rouen, for example, lists relics of saints already present in Rouen at the end of the 4th century, among them John the Baptist, the apostles Andrew and Thomas, Saint Euphemia of Chalcedon, and Luke the Evangelist. So I could find evidence for 14 Eastern saints and or relics. In most cases, churches or monasteries have been dedicated to them, and in less cases, relics are proved to have existed in Gaul. We know about the saints Saint Stephan, Tiresias, Polycarp, George, Cosmas and Damian, Sergius, Euphemia, John the Baptist, the apostles John, Andrew, and Thomas, Luke the Evangelist, and Saint Mary. Moreover, we know about relics from the True Cross. When we have a more detailed look, we see that, for example, the church and monastery dedications concentrate mainly on Saint Stephan, John the Baptist, or the Apostle. In several cases, it cannot be decided between them. And of course, other dedications remain small in number or are even unknown. What the relics are concerned, the spectrum is a bit broader, but still with concentrations. So relics from Saint Stephan, John the Baptist, and the True Cross, and at least Saint Mary outnumber all others, which are only single proofs or belong to the pieces that reached Gaul already at the end of the 4th century. My next question was how the churches, monasteries dedicated to Eastern saints and the Eastern relics mentioned here are distributed in Merovingian Gaul. We see the distribution of these dedications is of course low compared with all known churches of this time, but extends like a thin layer nearly over whole Gaul except for the west. The picture is quite different for the distribution of the relics, as they seem to concentrate in specific regions. Western Burgundy, along and south of the Loire Valley, in southwest Gaul, and with some spots in the north, where the proofs are mainly of a later Merovingian age. If this is not the distribution only caused by the fragmentary written record, it could be a hint on particular persons from particular dioceses that had more opportunities than others to get the precious relics for their bishopric. Especially for the region around Tours, the works of Gregory of Tours, as well as his engagement and networks, seem to be a plausible explanation for this concentration. Apart from the written record, we asked, of course, if there are any material remains of Eastern relics or reliquaries in Merovingian Gaul. And indeed, that the written evidence shows only a part of the whole picture could be proven, for example, by Michael McCormack, who studied in detail the two great early medieval relic hoards of Chelles and Sens. In both collections, relics from Gaul itself and Italy are the most common ones in Merovingian times, but in Sens, relics from Byzantium, from the Holy Land and Egypt formed 24%, nearly a quarter of all. Also, the relic hoard from Chelles was around 700 AD, formed by 8% of relics from the Holy Land. Dieter Quast has already mentioned this. The well-known and typical early Christian silver reliquaries of the East, frequently found in Byzantine contexts, have not been detected so far in Merovingian gold. But one must consider other kinds of relics, and by this I mean forms of secondary and contact relics, for example, resulting from pilgrimage. Pilgrimage from Western Europe to the holy places of the Eastern Mediterranean had a long and unbroken tradition, beginning with the Bordeaux pilgrim in 333 AD, and continued during the following centuries. We can state a small evidence for the pilgrimages in form of menas ampullae and flasks from other sites in the East that are distributed in Middle and Western Europe. In the first place, these pilgrim badges represent the pilgrim's individual religiousness, but it must be emphasized that only very few of them come from original early medieval contexts and can therefore document contemporaneous contexts. All others are a frequent element of church treasuries and museum collections and bear little information about relic translations in the early Middle Ages. Now I will talk about the ways of dissemination. I just touched it a bit with the pilgrimage badges, but it must be stated that in most cases the provenance of specific relics remains unknown. From time to time, some stories can be found in the written sources about the origin of single relics that may throw light on the ways of their dissemination, whereupon the validity of these notices is of course open. Some examples. The blood relic from St. John Baptist in the church in Bazar, southwestern France, was said to come from the beheading of the saint. A pious woman from Gaul attended the saint's execution and was able to collect some blood in a silver vessel that she later stored in the altar of the church. The origin of the body relic, kept in the Maurienne area, around here, was connected with a local woman coming back from pilgrimage. After several years of praying, fasting, and waiting, she received a body relic, a thumb, pollex, directly from the shrine of the saint's tomb. The relic of St. Stephan in Bordeaux, belonging to Bishop Bertram, was a piece of cloth once soaked with water that ran out of the garment worn by St. Stephan when the martyr appeared in a vision of an old woman. The relic of St. George that was kept in the oratory of a villa in the Diocese of Limoges was, following Gregory of Tours again, brought there by travelers who carried with them a reliquary with relics of different saints. They stayed the night nearby the church and the next morning were forced by a miracle to leave a part of the relics there. The body relic, a finger bone again, of St. Sergius kept in Bordeaux belonged after Gregory of Tours to a Syrian merchant called Euphron, who arranged a small church for the saint within his residential building. In 585, Bishop Bertram of Bordeaux, the usurper Gundovald, and the patricius Mumulus Oinius put pressure on Euphron because they wanted to see and at least get a piece from the relic. Gregory himself possessed a relic of St. Sergius too that was given by him to a new-built baptistery in Tours, but the origin is unknown. Concerning the apostles, information is also sparse, except for those which were carried by Gregory himself in a reliquary around his neck, some reliquary pendant, perhaps a cross. The relics of St. Andrew that were saved from a destroyed church in a Burgundian place and then transferred to Neuville-le-Roi were hung around the neck of a young girl in a reliquary capsula too. Gregory describes a man called John who traveled to the Holy Land to be cured from leper, obviously during the 6th century. After the successful therapy by bathing in the Jordan River, he visited Jerusalem, where he received relics from St. Mary that he brought back to Gaul, wrapped in linen cloth in a reliquary, capsa. But now I come to perhaps one of the most prominent relic transfers of this time, and this is of course the two-cross relic that was obtained by the former Merovingian queen Radegunde for her monastery in Poitiers, together with a reliquary. Maybe it is not by chance that this, compared with other Eastern relics, most appreciated and valuable piece has received a likewise dense record in the written sources of the time. Radegunde received it as a gift by the Byzantine Emperor Justin II and Empress Sophia after an official petition carried by Frankish ambassadors who have been sent by Radegunde to the Byzantine court. The reliquary survived in Poitiers until today with its enameled frame that was once held for the original from the 6th century, but most recent research resulted in a much younger date, to the 11th century. So we have at least no record of the original form. From Radegunde's biography, we learned at least that the relic was enshrined in gold and gemstones. Gregory of Tours describes the container of the relic in a different context as its silver chest. The whole event took place until 569 AD. In return for the wonderful reliquary, Justin II and Empress Sophia received a poem written by Venantius Fortunatus. The Byzantine rulers were glorified, and it was confirmed that the imperial hegemony was accepted in the Occident. The importance of this event cannot be estimated high enough because it is one of the earliest recorded translations of the true cross to the West. It was accompanied by relics from Eastern saints that are not described in more detail. It was evidence of Christ's presence in the monastery that immediately after its arrival was rededicated to the Holy Cross. In addition, building activities started soon afterwards. A special chapel was built for the relic. Very recently, Galit Noga Banai has argued, based on the excavated residuals of this chapel, with a small exterior room here, added to the apse where the relic is supposed to have been kept, that this architecture is unique in Merovingian Gaul. She suggested that the architects in Poitiers wanted to shape a visual familiarity with the architecture of Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, where the relic of the true cross was also kept in an exterior room behind the apse, positioned there by a member of the Constantine family, perhaps Constantine I himself. The parallels with Santa Croce are convincing, also compared with the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, but the position of the cross is different. Anyway, while celebrating the finding of the cross on the 3rd May, the same day as in Rome, and composing the architecture in the described way, Radegunde could evoke an association with Santa Croce, its imperial patronage, and with St. Helena, who herself was connected not only to Rome, but of course to Jerusalem too. With this total package, she achieved an impact that soon gained supra-regional importance in Merovingian Gaul. Transfers of these outstanding relics took place mainly in the context of diplomatic exchange. Within the contact between Byzantium and the Merovingians, in this chart you see the number of different embassies at different times, this happened only twice. And the other very prominent relic transfer that is occasionally connected to a Frankish embassy that returned around 630 AD from Heraclius I, soon after his victory over the Persians and the return of the true cross to Jerusalem, to King Dagobert I. A permanent peace was concluded between the rulers, and the Byzantine emperor asked Dagobert to baptize all Jewish people in his realm. The monumental cloisonné cross, work ascribed to the famous goldsmith and royal magister monetarius St. Eligius, that was fabricated in the following years, obviously with the purpose to incorporate a true cross relic, was the starting point for Hajo Virk several years ago to consider whether Heraclius could have sent Dagobert also a fragment of the true cross at the same time. In several publications, this assumption meanwhile appears like a fact. But one has to bear in mind that it cannot be proven, as no written source of the time or later mentions this kind of relic transfer. And in view of the true cross fragment given to Radegunde and its echo in the contemporaneous and later record, it is more than amazing that this extraordinary important imperial gift left no traces. Now, I would like to conclude and to sum up the main results concerning the phenomenon of Eastern relics in late antique and Merovingian Gaul. The character of the relics is mixed. It seems that many have been contact or secondary relics, but blood or body relics can also be proven. We have seen that their number is limited and that reliquaries did not survive. The containers of the relics are only occasionally mentioned in the written sources, and where we get more detailed information, the containers are described as capsules, capsulae, or as pendants from necklaces. In addition, there exists only little information about the circumstances of their transfer. But it is striking that in most of the recorded cases, some kind of private agency, I mean the initiative of single persons like bishops, travelers, merchants coming from the east, or pilgrims returning from the holy places, is responsible for the import, and in addition, close connections between high-ranking clerics. On the other hand, one must be careful with further conclusions on the basis of the written record. The reliability of the stories told, for example, by Gregory and others that developed around some of the relics is open. Apart from these possibilities, the transfer of precious and high-ranking relics and reliquaries is often connected with Byzantine gift diplomacy. Donations by the Byzantine emperors always had different meanings. Ostensibly, they showed the emperor's appreciation and respect, but by accepting the Byzantine gifts, the foreign rulers simultaneously accepted the supremacy of the Byzantine emperor and were virtually integrated into the imperial hierarchy. Among the goods transferred to the West, gifts of relics and reliquaries were the most outstanding, because they put the connection between donor and receiver downright on the sacral level. Especially relics of the True Cross, but also all other relics connected with the Passion of Christ, certainly were the most desirable possible donations, and only few chosen foreign rulers were privileged to receive them. With a policy of a very restricted granting of True Cross fragments, they were held in an abeyance between desire and dependency, but with the reception of such a relic, they accepted the Byzantines' exclusive ownership and supremacy. So, Eastern relics in late antique and Merovingian gold show a great variety. Their shape and character comprise highest-ranking pieces, but also pilgrim flasks, and the ways of their dissemination range from private agency to highest diplomatic context. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for this presentation. And now, immediately, I would like to open the discussion, because the discussion should take place in this very moment. I recall that Eleonore had previsited the system with a written question. Probably it works very well, but it hasn't been used. It doesn't mean that there will be no discussion, but I ask everybody now if you have oral demands, oral question to address to any of the communicants, to do so now, as well as to the introductory relation by Eleonora herself, or the one by Alain Dubroc, and the two last one by Dieter Prast and Jörg Drauschke. If somebody wants to ask something, nothing, because I speak in French, that will be easier for me. Des aspects très très importants ont été évoqués, aussi bien au point de vue des formes et des usages, ce qui était attendu. Il y a peut-être des aspects moins immédiatement attendus qui ont été mis au premier plan, comme justement ce problème de la durée d'utilisation de ces reliquaires, qui peut apparaître effectivement très variable, ce dont témoignent les réparations, les changements d'usage aussi, comme dans le cas de la chrismale de Mortain. On n'a peut-être pas parlé aussi de, si on a parlé à la fin, Jörg Drauschke l'a évoqué, le remplacement des reliquaires, puisqu'il y a ce cas donc du reliquaire de la Sainte Croix de Radegonde, qui en fait aujourd'hui n'est que le substitut du XIe siècle d'un original disparu. Tous ces problèmes sont évidemment fondamentaux. Il y a aussi la question qui a été mise au premier plan, celle-là, on l'avait tous naturellement en tête, mais il était une excellente chose de la remettre, si l'on peut dire, au premier plan, aussi bien comme l'ont fait Dieter Quast que Jürgen Grauschke encore, la question de ces relations entre Orient et Occident, dans la mesure où on a toujours eu tendance à trop considérer que le Haut Moyen-Âge était une époque de cloisonnement, et au contraire, même après la fin de ce qu'il est convenu d'appeler l'Antiquité tardive, ces échanges par les diverses voies qui ont été ici évoquées n'ont pas cessé et ont été déterminants, en particulier pour le type d'objet et d'usage d'ailleurs de ce dont nous traitons. Voilà, je répète encore, est-ce qu'il y a des questions, des remarques à apporter à ce qui a été dit?
Jean-Pierre, il y a une question de Anna Gannon.
Oui.
Pour Dieter Quast.
Oui, please. Oui.
Anna, vuoi presentare la tua domanda che vedo scritta? So the question was, can you say more about the reliquaries?
Non vedo nessuna domanda scritta, dunque non so che cosa succede.
The question was in the chat. The question is, can you say more about the reliquaries in Merovingian France?
Of course I can. Can you hear me? I didn't say more about them because we have a lecture tomorrow on the Merovingian ones, and that's why I decided to say not so much on them. Should I answer? Will we discuss it tomorrow, or should I give a small lecture?
If I may say, I'll be talking about some reliquaries which are very similar to those you've shown. So maybe tomorrow we can have a discussion about, I'm very interested in the cylindrical ones that you showed.
Yes.
Yeah, so you don't need to talk now, but maybe tomorrow.
Yep, so you are interested in the ones from the rural churches.
Yes, please, yes.
These are not only rural churches, I have to say, but lots of them were found in rural churches while excavations in the altar regions or under the altar. We have house-shaped reliquaries covered with bone or antler plates. Unfortunately, we were not able to date them correctly because they have only circles or eye patterns inside it, and this is really a pity. I told you that we are able to make a very good chronology, but in case of this bone plate covered ones, we are not. Or aren't you only interested in the pyxes I showed? Because of them we have, to be honest, we have very few of them. I think this were nearly all I showed on the photo. One of them is of Chur, one of them is from Paspel, so they are from the Alpine regions, but we have those pyxes formed objects in lot of no, not in lot, but in some female graves from the late Merovingian period.
So the cylindrical ones are from female graves, would you say?
Sorry?
The cylindrical metal ones, presumably.
The cylindrical metal ones are, so this was, I wouldn't say it's an exception, but it's an exception because it had a Christogram on the bottom. We have a lot of these cylindrical ones, we call them amulet capsule. And you see the difficulty to, is it a relic container or is it a container for some some amulets, and the border between is not easy to detect. Only in this one from Mareuil in France has a Christogram on the bottom, so I'm quite sure that this must be a sort of relic, a private relic container. And it is from, this one is not from a church, but it's from a female grave.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
So there is another question, I think, for Dieter about the size of these small reliquaries.
So even without microphone, this works. They are like this. So maybe they are lower than 10 centimeters, this Pyxides. The bone Pyxides could be a little bit larger, but this metal one is, let's say, 6-7 centimeters. Was it the question or?
It was a question, I think.
Okay, so then I hope.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I would have a little question for Jörg, if I can. So it is both for Jörg and Dieter. So what is, in your opinion, the role that could be played by chemical and physical analysis in order to determine chronology, regionality, and the provenance of these objects after these incredible trips from the Eastern Mediterranean to the goal to Merovingian to the Merovingian world, for example?
I may answer first. Your question, thank you very much. It reminds me on a study that was accomplished several years ago in the Netherlands with relics there. And it was, they tried to do a radiocarbon dating of the bones in the relics. And the surprise was that the bones, a lot of them were really from the age the relics should have been. So at least to study the chronology is this a very important tool. The analysis, it's, as I said, it's several years that this was done, and they didn't do any further analysis like strontium or isotopes or so, but to study these, it would be, of course, also interesting to get to know a bit more about the provenance of the relics themselves. But now I speak about the relics, not about the reliquaries. Dieter said something about, for example, the dendrochronology of the wooden boxes, and this is also, of course, very interesting. But perhaps Dieter wants to say something about that.
Yes, I wanted to say something about the dendrochronology, but you said it already. We have the possibility for the dendrochronology because lots of the reliquaries had wooden cores, and of course there was nobody dealing with dendrochronology in the moment. When I was working with the Anna Beuren one, I tried to do dendrochronology with X-rays, but unfortunately it wasn't possible. So we couldn't take a piece of wood out of the reliquary, of course, and this was not possible. But for the provenance, it's also interesting not to show where it was from, but maybe sometimes to show where it was not from, because you can see if you analyze the wood of the cores that it's local wood from the region where the reliquaries were found, and you have nothing where you can say, oh, this is from the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is a small help, but a small help is even better than nothing.
Thank you.
So no more now.
You can.
It's an art historian speaking, and excuse me if I speak in English, but I'm addressing it really to Jörg Grauschka. it was wonderful to see such a marvelous photograph of the St. Redegund reliquary, because the photographs that I've always seen in the past have been almost impossible to interpret. But in passing, you said that this, the enameled mount of the reliquary was 11th century. And I just ask, it was a very quick moment, I looked at it, and I wonder if that could possibly be right. Are we not barely talking about something which was enameled around 1300? Looks to me very much as if it's part of the world of the émaux de plique. And so I ask, but perhaps this is my ignorance. Perhaps the literature has fixed this 11th century date, in which case I find the enamel absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, thank you very much. I must answer as an archaeologist and not as an art historian. And I found this chronology and this dating of the enameled frame in the literature. I think it was Skubiszewski, if I pronounce the name right, that several years ago yes, came to this date of the enameled frame. But Professor Caillé perhaps knows more about it. Perhaps it could also be the 12th century, but in the end, this is really not my,
if I could
my
just,
discipline.
Yes, if I could just say that, of course, cloisonné, normally everybody says, oh, it's 11th, 12th century because it's cloisonné, but everybody tends to overlook that, of course, cloisonné never, cloisonné on gold never ceases in the West. And there is this renaissance of gold cloisonné in Paris around 1280 with the émaux de plique, and many of the features of that thing remind me very strongly of the tiny little émaux de plique, they're called in the documents. But perhaps Jean-Pierre has a view on this.
No, I think unfortunately, Neil, I have no more idea about that. I know it's very complicated, but
there's no document which says.
After what our colleague Jörg told a moment before, in fact, 11th century, that didn't seem me impossible, in fact. And I think if Skubiszewski proposed this datation, he knows a lot of things.
Madame Gautier.
Not a guarantee, but in fact, he didn't advance this hazardly. But
I expect.
In fact, you are right, Neil. There is a very strong connection with this émaux de plique. Yes, and so perhaps it's necessary to think again about that.
I wonder if we shouldn't. If there's no document, of course, there may be a document which I'm not aware of. I think that the dating probably comes from Madame Gautier, doesn't it? I mean, so many of these dates of enamels come from her. And of course, she lived near Poitiers, and she lived in Langon, and she's very much in Western France and knew the reliquary very well.
So,
but I'm ready to be corrected. Thank you.
No more question now.
Thank you very much. I say I'm ready to. I hope that somebody will correct me. Yes.
This time it's over, I think. Now I am thinking that we still have 5 relations. And if we don't want to finish at 10 o'clock tonight, perhaps it's better to cut off now. And if Eleonora agrees, no more than 5 minutes of interruption, and we begin immediately with Marie-Christine Comte. Allora, se siete qui di nuovo tutti voi, possiamo riprendere et adesso, maintenant, donc je vais donner la parole à Marie-Christine Comte notre UMR 7041 de la Maison de l'Archéologie à Nanterre pour sa communication sur les reliquaires du Proche-Orient entre Palestine et Syrie. À vous, Marie-Christine.
Oui, alors, partager. Est-ce que vous voyez l'écran?
Oui.
Oui.
Attendez, mais je vois rien du tout, moi.
Oui, oui, c'est bon. Pour nous, c'est bon.
D'accord.
Voilà.
Ouais.
Pardon. Est-ce que vous voyez l'écran?
Oui, oui, tout à fait.
D'accord. Alors, bonjour mesdames, bonjour messieurs. Je remercie les personnes ayant organisé ce colloque ainsi que toutes celles qui sont présentes aujourd'hui. Après le passage de Paul à Damas et sa conversion, puis la formation d'une communauté chrétienne à Antioche, les villes syriennes furent les premières à recevoir la bonne nouvelle après Jérusalem. Le christianisme, introduit en Syrie depuis ses débuts, attesté dès la fin du IIe et le début du IIIe siècle, va ensuite s'épanouir après la paix de l'Église. C'est plus particulièrement dans le nord de la Syrie, une région prospère depuis les 1er et 2e siècles, que le culte des martyrs, en s'installant dans les églises nouvellement construites, va prendre un aspect très original. La Syrie du Nord a livré le plus grand nombre de reliquaires de tout le Proche-Orient, environ 200 sur 300. Ces derniers viennent pour la plupart du massif calcaire situé entre Antioche, Béroé et Apamée. Leurs particularités sont les suivantes. Ils affectent tous une taille imposante, qu'ils soient en forme de sarcophage comme en forme de cipe, et une circulation d'huile qui, versée par le couvercle, sanctifiée par son passage sur les reliques, ressort dans un réceptacle à l'avant de la cuve où elle peut être collectée. Ces volumineuses lipsanothèques sont disposées à plusieurs sur le sol d'une chapelle qui leur est dédiée, que l'on appelle le martyrion, située sur le côté sud de l'abside. Quelques images. Fafertine est un antique village du Djebel Seman au nord-est du massif calcaire. Réoccupé à l'époque moderne, il a conservé une église dans laquelle un reliquaire occupait l'annexe sud. Il est en forme de cipe de 86 cm de haut avec un décor en façade composé de cercles, fleurons et arcs sur colonnes. Une inscription provenant probablement du linteau de la porte ouest, trouvée employée dans une maison moderne par Tchalenko, portant la date de 372, a permis de dater l'église et aussi le reliquaire. À cette haute époque, l'accès au martyrion se faisait par une porte du mur sud et par la petite porte de la chapelle. Dans un autre bourg du Djebel Seman, bourg Eida, qui compte 6 églises construites entre le milieu du IVe et le VIe siècle, l'église centrale est la plus ancienne. La pièce au sud fut transformée au Ve siècle avec élargissement vers le sud jusqu'à l'alignement avec le portique et ajout à l'est d'une grande absidiole dans laquelle 3 reliquaires en forme de sarcophage et à circulation d'huile prirent place. Côté ouest, un grand arc donnant dans le collatéral sud remplaça la porte précédente. Les accès à cette chapelle sont donc multiples. L'église a ensuite fonctionné de cette manière pendant 2 siècles. Le village de Bakira, dans le Djebel Barisha, possède 2 églises. Celle de l'ouest, construite au 5e siècle, fait partie d'un complexe monastique avec une église, une cour et un petit baptistère. Cette basilique à colonnes datée de 416 par une inscription sur le linteau de la porte sud-est fut construite probablement par Markianos Kiris, le prêtre architecte. Une deuxième phase, au début du VIe siècle, qui aurait pu faire suite à un tremblement de terre, entraîna une modification du chevet et la création d'un arc d'accès au martyrion. 3 reliquaires, un en forme de sarcophage, 2 autres en forme de cipe, ont été retrouvés installés donc sur les côtés de la pièce. À propos de ces reliquaires syriens, le calcaire de grande qualité du massif calcaire a permis, outre la construction des maisons, des églises et de leurs reliefs sculptés, mais aussi de tous les reliquaires trouvés sur place. Les maîtres d'œuvre, les tailleurs de pierre et les artisans locaux ou appartenant à des ateliers ambulants venant en général d'Antioche ont fait preuve d'une grande créativité en variant les formes et les décors. Il est probable que les commanditaires étaient soit le clergé local, soit les fidèles eux-mêmes, très attachés au culte des martyrs. Concernant ce décor des reliquaires, il apparaît surtout en façade et la présence d'un arc sur colonne, comme vous le voyez ici, sur ces 3 exemples, entourant la vasque de sortie d'huile est un motif symbolique qui rappelle l'arc triomphal de l'abside ainsi que l'arc d'entrée dans le martyrion. S'y ajoutent parfois des croix et autres motifs géométriques et floraux que l'on trouve dans d'autres sites comme à Bayeux et à Déesse. Le circuit emprunté par les fidèles pour entrer dans le martyrion est clair. Les portes donnent à la fois, donc on a vu dans le portique, la cour attenante, dans le collatéral sud, pèlerins et fidèles entrent par la porte située côté sud et pénètrent donc en dehors des offices jusqu'au martyrion. Leur dévotion se fait au moyen de l'huile, le saint liquide donc passe par du couvercle et sort dans la cuve. Il peut apporter bienfait ou servir de remède aux dévots. C'est ce système de circulation d'huile qui est typique des reliquaires syriens. Après une augmentation du nombre des reliquaires au 5e et 6e siècle, quelques modifications peuvent intervenir à la fin du 6e siècle, comme un placement des reliquaires devant l'arc triomphal. Ici, à Kirbizé, plus à l'ouest dans le Djebel El Ala, le village de Kirbizé a vu une de ses maisons modifiée en église à nef unique vers la fin du IVe siècle, avec transformation de la partie orientale en sanctuaire et installation de reliquaires dans la partie sud. On a retrouvé donc 3 reliquaires à l'intérieur, un en forme de sarcophage, et tous les autres, c'est-à-dire 5 autres reliquaires qui ont été retrouvés sur place, étaient en forme de cipe. Si les premiers peuvent dater du début du VIe siècle, les 2 reliquaires avec un décor plus schématique seraient de la fin du VIe siècle. Dans cette église, on constate, comme dans d'autres d'ailleurs, la présence d'un sarcophage qui n'est pas représenté ici, mais qui se trouvait dans la cour, et également un petit baptistère installé au cours du VIe siècle. Cette configuration se retrouve dans d'autres églises, à Béris-Nord, à Béthir, à Kfer d'Artas et dans d'autres. On ignore en général de quels saints il s'agissait, quels étaient, aucun nom n'a été conservé sur ces reliquaires, à part un seul, unique, qui est dédié donc à Saint Arbélos, dans le petit village de Kfer d'Artas du Djebel Seman. Alors, s'agissait-il de reliques de prêtres, de saints stylites, de reclus? On a vu qu'il y avait des sarcophages de fondateurs, de moines vénérés. On ignore complètement les noms des saints qui étaient conservés. En outre, ces populations villageoises disposaient de petits baptistères qui étaient toujours situés très près des reliques. Alors, c'est des baptistères, des cuves baptismales petites, modestes, souvent donc à côté du martyrion, dans une pièce attenante, dans la cour ou dans une construction à part. On trouve même des exemples de baptistères qui sont à part avec à l'intérieur un reliquaire. Donc, il apparaît que le sacrement du baptême était renforcé par la présence des reliquaires, car la relique, c'est l'intercesseur. Reliques et reliquaires attirent le sacrement, le baptême attire les fidèles. Cela crée un programme qui a des retombées pour l'Église. Concernant la diffusion de ces reliquaires, En Syrie seconde, les reliquaires de grande taille et de divers matériaux sont souvent placés sur un socle dans le martyrion qui est placé au nord. La sortie d'huile se fait par le petit côté cette fois. En Phénicie seconde, les reliquaires sont plus petits et leur nombre se réduit. Quant en Phénicie première, aucun reliquaire n'a été retrouvé. Ces reliquaires syriens se sont diffusés aux marges du massif calcaire, en Euphratésie, en Osroène. On a quelques très rares exemples retrouvés beaucoup plus loin qui vont reprendre ces circulations d'huile. Par exemple, en Arabie, l'église du prêtre Wahil Doum el-Rassas a un reliquaire que l'on dit syrien. Et en Occident, à Marseille, une mémoria située dans l'abside de l'église reprend le schéma des sarcophages à huile de Warté et de déesses. On constate aussi qu'au sud de Damas et de Césarée de Philippe, ces gros reliquaires à huile disparaissent totalement. En Palestine première, des petits reliquaires occupent un autre emplacement dans l'église. Ils sont souvent de matériaux plus précieux comme le marbre. Le système de dévotion tient là encore à la présence d'huile ou de liquide dans le reliquaire qui baigne les reliques. Plusieurs moyens permettent de s'approprier la sainteté de ces intercesseurs que sont les reliques, soit en déposant des brandéas, des morceaux de tissu sur le couvercle, soit en glissant une baguette dans l'orifice afin qu'elle se charge du précieux liquide sanctifié et de toutes les vertus de la relique. Et des saints et martyrs, bien entendu. Quelques exemples. Dans l'église du Mont des Oliviers à Jérusalem, ce site fouillé à la toute fin du XIXe siècle par Bliss a mis au jour une église conventuelle byzantine dont la partie sud n'est pas conservée. À peu près au milieu du demi-cercle de l'abside était, sous l'emplacement de l'autel, une fosse de 50 cm de long sur 40 cm de profondeur, s'ouvrait vers l'est par une petite porte écroulée sous le poids des déblais. Dans le loculus, entouré de dalles de marbre, un petit reliquaire, coffret reliquaire de 15 cm de côté, côtoyait une petite base de colonnettes tous les deux posés sur des dalles. Ce petit coffret dont le nom pourrait avoir abrité les reliques ou le souvenir immatériel d'un martyr ou d'un saint dont le nom nous échappe. La petite base de colonnettes était peut-être une relique secondaire. Le loculus n'était pas hermétiquement fermé, il était facile de retirer le reliquaire de son loculus pour le placer sur l'autel pour les dévotions des fidèles les jours de fête. C'était donc un reliquaire à contact qui n'était pas en permanence sous l'autel. Vous avez ici une reconstitution de l'autel et de son reliquaire. Dans l'église de Ain Haniya, située au sud-ouest de Jérusalem, fouillée en 1932, l'église à 3 nefs a été partiellement taillée dans le rocher sur ses côtés est et sud. Le fouilleur propose une datation au 5e et 6e siècle. L'autel dont il reste les traces à la corde, de sa position à la corde de l'abside, se trouvait au-dessus d'un loculus également taillé dans le rocher, garni de plaques de marbre. Dans cette fosse de 75 cm de long, 40 cm de profondeur, se trouvaient 2 reliquaires de marbre, chacun de 15 cm de long. L'un complet, en forme de sarcophage, contenait encore des ossements, lesquels, une fois analysés en 1985, ont révélé la présence donc de 2 fragments humains et un d'un os animal. L'autre cuve, à 2 compartiments, était incomplète. Ce bâtiment a connu plusieurs phases, visibles pour 2 d'entre elles dans les réaménagements des pièces annexes. Les 2 reliquaires sont du type à vénération par contact, traditionnel en Palestine, et le loculus qui le contenait n'était pas scellé, même si ce reliquaire numéro 1 était inviolé. Le fouilleur mentionne bien l'accessibilité de la fosse d'autel. Cette vénération par contact, quand elle est pratiquée sur les reliquaires portables de petite dimension, elle nécessite une surélévation du reliquaire. Il faut donc en déduire que ceux-ci précisément n'étaient pas à demeure sous l'autel et qu'ils ont peut-être occupé un autre emplacement précédemment et à des périodes différentes. Enfin, à 10 km au nord-ouest de Jérusalem, des fouilles plus récentes sur le site de Khirbet Silla en 1996 ont mis au jour une église byzantine datée de la première moitié du VIe, qui connut 3 phases avant son abandon dans la deuxième moitié du VIIe siècle. 2 reliquaires y ont été trouvés. L'un dans une niche, enfin du moins au bas de la niche du bas-côté nord. Le second était sous l'autel, dans une fosse accessible. Plusieurs inscriptions ont permis de retracer l'histoire de l'église. Le premier reliquaire en calcaire, en forme de caisse, ici, de 24 cm de long, contemporain de la construction de l'église au début du VIe siècle, devait donc être placé sous l'autel, puisque l'inscription de la nef mentionne le jour du dépôt des reliques de Saint Théodore, donc là on a le nom du saint, mais on n'a pas la date. Le jour du dépôt, le 11 novembre, mais l'année nous manque. Vers le milieu du VIe siècle, le premier reliquaire fut déplacé vers la niche du bas-côté et tandis que sous l'autel rénové prenait place le deuxième reliquaire de marbre. Ainsi, 2 pôles de dévotion étaient attestés dans la seconde moitié du VIe siècle. Le reliquaire de marbre de 17 cm de long a dû contenir les reliques des saints mentionnés sur la base inscrite du nouvel autel. Il y a 5 noms. Il pouvait être sorti de son loculus et placé sur l'autel pour les dévotions. Ces exemples de Palestine première nous montrent que les reliquaires palestiniens de petite taille étaient placés sous l'autel, toujours accessible, et qu'un second pôle de dévotion existait dans l'église. La diffusion de ce modèle s'est faite vers l'Arabie, la Palestine seconde, la Palestine troisième, et avec quelques variantes dans leur emplacement. Parfois installés dans le sol ou sur des tables annexes, dans des niches également, plusieurs pôles de dévotion étaient observés toujours. En fin de période, ces reliquaires de sanctification par contact pouvaient être enfermés sous l'autel et devenir ainsi des reliquaires de consécration. On en a des exemples à Pella en Palestine seconde, Ayoun Moussa et Riyad en Arabie. En conclusion, si les reliquaires sont apparus en même temps en Palestine et en Syrie, comme vous l'avez vu, la différence dans la présentation des reliques et de son culte dans ces 2 territoires est manifeste. Le choix de la Syrie du Nord de développer le culte des reliques en disposant dans une chapelle à part une pléthore de grosses lipsanothèques à circulation d'huile que les fidèles visitaient lors de pèlerinages locaux pourrait bien avoir un sens. Nous formulons l'hypothèse suivante. Le grand éloignement de ces villages de la Terre Sainte aurait conduit les chrétiens de cette région à multiplier le nombre d'intercesseurs que sont les reliques et à créer ces gros contenants pour mieux les protéger, les valoriser et affirmer ainsi leur foi. En Palestine première, les lieux saints, la Galilée, sanctifiés par le passage des prophètes, des apôtres, de Jésus lui-même, constituaient les lieux reliques où la terre foulée par le Christ était sacrée. Les haltes des pèlerinages formaient des lieux reliques, comme certains paysages de Galilée. De même, les sites traversés par le Christ étaient autant de villages reliques où dans les églises, 1 ou 2 petits reliquaires étaient conservés. Enfin, dans le lieu le plus saint du christianisme, Jérusalem, se trouvait la relique la plus essentielle et primordiale, le tombeau du Christ, au-dessus duquel Constantin avait fait ériger l'Anastasis, s'y ajouta le bois de la croix découvert par sa mère Hélène auparavant, comme une seconde relique. Je vous remercie.
Merci Marie-Christine. Alors effectivement, cette communication a l'avantage de nous montrer un matériel où là, non seulement nous avons les reliquaires qui déjà sont pourvus à travers leurs inscriptions d'indications tout à fait importantes, mais en plus un contexte archéologique et architectural qui offre évidemment un éclairage extraordinaire sur les pratiques, sur les rituels qui entouraient ces objets. Merci beaucoup. Now I call Holger Klein from Columbia University, and we go on in the Byzantine world with the relation about Byzantine reliquaries and the rhetoric of enshrinement. Please.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. And before I begin my talk, Eleonora, perhaps you can share my screen for me. That would take something off my back, and I think it would go smoother that way.
Yes, yes. Okay. Just a minute.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. Before I begin my talk, let me take this opportunity to thank Eleonora De Stefanis and her team at Vercelli very much for their kind invitation to participate in this exciting conference. Despite the virtual format the conference had to take due to the COVID crisis, I am not only hopeful, but sure that the conversations and the discussions that we will have over the next day and a half will continue in person on-site at Vercelli and elsewhere when the pandemic is finally behind us, and I hope that will be sooner rather than later. It is a great pleasure for me to contribute to our conference a brief history of some of the trends and developments in Byzantine reliquary design that carry through from the 4th through the 10th century and beyond. While 15 minutes is not enough time to even scratch the surface of such a complex and multifaceted topic, I will do my best to fulfill the mandate given to me by Eleonora, but focus less on those precious reliquaries that are used in liturgical, ceremonial, and devotional contexts, the image programs and epigraphy, and that might come as a disappointment to some. Instead, I want to focus on a few trends in Byzantine reliquary design that remain stable throughout the Byzantine period. As I have shown elsewhere, much could be said about the interplay between texts and images and sacred matter in Byzantine reliquary design, and how these objects tend to engage us on multiple levels all at once. They can speak to us through their images, poetic inscriptions, or mere descriptive titles, give expression to a pious donor's identity, hopes, and intentions. Over the last 2 decades, the material turn in the humanities and social sciences and the rise of thing theory as a distinct field of study has led to a renewed interest in physical matter and object-based research, including the study of Christian relics, fragmented things that defy a clear-cut designation as precious objects or holy subjects, and often oscillate between states of being that cannot easily be described as either dead or alive, active or inactive, matter or spirit. Reliquaries, the containers of such spirited matter, for the lack of a better word, likewise communicate their contents through physical shape, often accompanied by inscriptions, some lengthy and poetic, are placed within a broader architectural context. These containers lend their contents voice and identity. 21 years into the 21st century, the thing power of such objects and their ability to develop agency in a spatial continuum with other things and human bodies is perhaps more readily acceptable to art historians than 2 decades ago, when Bruno Latour and others first examined the role of human and non-human actors in complex technical systems and knowledge processes, and when Jane Bennett began to develop new ways of thinking about the agency of objects. Art historians have benefited much from the theoretical work of colleagues in other disciplines, such as Susan Stewart and Patricia Cox-Miller, who were among the first to articulate and theorize how the sensual engagement with miniaturized objects or fragmented remains, such as relics, helped the beholder to unlock a world of wonder
and inspire devotional practices that allow for a collapsing of time and space through such immersive activities. While I have no time today to dive more deeply into the theoretical concerns and do justice to all of the issues related to fragmentation, miniaturization, animation, and the agency of objects, I will do my best to highlight at least some of those aspects where appropriate. Since we are little more than 2 weeks away from the feast of the translation of the body of St. John Chrysostom, which the Greek Orthodox Church celebrates on January 27th to commemorate the return of the Patriarch's remains from Comana, the city of his exile, to Constantinople in 438, I thought it might serve as an appropriate starting point for my brief survey today. As pictured here in the famous Menologion of Basil II, a manuscript produced in Constantinople around the year 1000, the Patriarch's body likely arrived in the capital in a wooden casket. When it was first exhibited and opened in the church of Hagia Irene, his disciple and successor on the patriarchal throne, Proclus, found his body incorrupt and ensured that his saintly remains would be transferred immediately in solemn procession to the Church of the Holy Apostles, distinctly identifiable in the Menologion's miniature as Emperor Justinian's 6th century multi-domed structure. Proclus's choice of the Church of the Holy Apostles as John Chrysostom's final resting place was an appropriate and flattering homage for the exiled patriarch, who thus joined the apostles Andrew, Luke, and Timothy, whose relics had arrived in Constantinople a century earlier, namely in 356 and 360, and were deposited in the same church together with the remains of the city's founder, Constantine the Great. The next slide, please. It is no coincidence that the transfer of the relics of Timothy in Constantinople are similarly pictured in an imperial Menologion produced in Constantinople around 1050. The only difference being that the formal appearance of the apostle's casket here resembles a stone sarcophagus with a pitched roof. Little survives in terms of material evidence for the earliest shrines made to contain the whole bodies of Christian saints and martyrs. Literary accounts of their martyrdom or translations such as the Passio of the 2nd century Saint Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, usually tell us nothing about the size, makeup, or formal appearance of the relics containers. And if they do, they often project practices common during the lifetime of the hagiographer back into the past. We therefore do not know what the first or subsequent reliquaries for the ashes of Saint Polycarp looked like, or how the body of the 3rd century Saint Babylas, Patriarch of Antioch, was enshrined when it was transferred from a cemetery outside the city to the suburb of Daphne in 354. Nor do we know how the bodies of Saint Timothy and John Chrysostom were actually enshrined when they arrived in Constantinople in 360 and 438 respectively, and how exactly they were deposited in the Church of the Holy Apostles. There's a discussion about Timothy and where he was exactly placed. Only in one rare instance, to my knowledge, has evidence been preserved for such an early arrangement, namely in the case of the 4th century Bishop Paulinus of Trier, who was exiled to Phrygia at the Synod of Arles in 353 and died there 5 years later. Like the body of St. John Chrysostom, his remains were eventually returned a few decades after his death in 395 and carried all the way back to distant Germany. When the stone sarcophagus of St. Paulinus was opened in Trier in the early 1880s, the 4th century cedar coffin inside the larger stone sarcophagus quickly disintegrated, but its metal armatures and decorative plaques survived, and its form could be faithfully reconstructed. The next slide, please. Based on the analysis of the decorative plaques and the type of wood for the coffin, it has been suggested that this was the very coffin in which the body of Saint Paulinus was returned from Phrygia. Perhaps surprisingly, it matches the simple form of the coffin of Saint John Chrysostom as pictured by the 10th century artist of the Menologion of Basil II. The transfer and subsequent veneration of a saint's whole and uncorrupted body, however, was considerably less common for early Christian saints and martyrs than for the so-called new saints, often monks and ecclesiastics who gained popularity as, quote, heroes of orthodoxy during the Middle and late Byzantine periods. As Alice Mary Talbot has shown, a number of Byzantine saints' lives recount miracle stories that played out at the tombs of previously unrecognized saintly figures, such as Saint Theodora of Thessaloniki, a late 9th century Cenobitic nun who revealed herself through a series of miracles at the site of her tomb. Of course, it didn't hurt that her daughter was the abbess of the monastery at that time. Saint Mary the Younger of Bizia in Thrace, a laywoman and contemporary of Theodora, likewise revealed herself through a healing miracle at her tomb. A demoniac who had managed to push open the lid of St. Mary's sarcophagus in the narthex of Bizia's cathedral in a frenzy, vomited forth his demon after touching the saint's forearm with his mouth. Throughout the Byzantine period, saints' marble tombs or wooden coffins were thus not an uncommon locus of miraculous activity, and their relocation within the same church or the same city is not unheard of as a means to accommodate their growing cult. As Vasilios Marinis and Robert Osterhout have shown, the locations of such saintly tombs or shrines was not fixed, but could vary considerably depending on historical circumstances and local needs. The tomb of Saint Mary the Younger, for instance, was moved out of the narthex of Bizia Cathedral at the saint's direction and deposited in an oratory newly built by her former husband Nikephoros, not far from her original resting place. The next slide, please. The body of the 10th century Saint Luke of Styris, on the other hand, was first buried underneath or beneath the floor of his cell, then re-enshrined in a small cruciform octerion in the crypt of the monastery's new Catholicon, and ultimately moved up into the Catholicon proper to an area where it intersects with the old Panagia church. It's indicated here in the slide in the original location on the right, and the upstairs location in the left. And the next slide, please. You see a detail of the current situation in the upstairs Catholicon. A final example may be provided by the remains of the Serbian king Stephan Uroš III Dechanski, next slide please, whose body, after being elevated to the status of a royal saint in 1343, was transferred from his original marble sarcophagus, which you see here on the right, in the southwestern part of the monastery's church at Dechany, to a finely carved and radiantly colored wooden shrine, and moved to the threshold of the sanctuary for the veneration of the faithful. And you see that on the left in the ground plan. Unlike these post-iconoclastic saints, the bodies of early Christian saints and martyrs were rarely found whole and intact when they communicated their desire to be relocated to a more fitting place of burial and veneration. Bishop Victricius of Rouen, who we've already heard from, who had received a precious gift of such rediscovered remains from his colleague Ambrose of Milan in 396, was among the first theologians to address the problem or concern with the fragmented saintly body. There is nothing in Relics which is not complete, he wrote in a treatise in his treatise in praise of the saints. And I quote, "Where the healing power is intact, the limbs are intact. Why then do we call them relics? We impress on them the name relics because we cannot do otherwise with the seal of living language. We've seen quote in French translation earlier. But by uttering the whole in the part, we open the eyes of the heart, not the barriers of our bodily sight. End of quote. Victricius was not alone in his conviction that relics required a different kind of seeing and an understanding of words as images and signs of things. His sentiments were shared by like-minded colleagues such as Paulinus of Nola, who advised his friend Sulpicius Severus that he should cherish the gift of a small fragment of the true cross. And I quote, "In this almost invisible, indivisible particle of a small sliver, take up the protection of your immediate safety. Let not your faith shrink because the eyes behold evidence so small. Let it look with the inner eye on the whole power of the cross in this tiny fragment." Recipients of such exceedingly precious yet spectacularly unimpressive sacred remains generally faced a difficult choice when handling such wooden splinters, bone fragments, and pieces of dust. They could either enshrine them in a precious object and use it for personal adornment and protection, or enclose them in a precious container destined for reburial inside or in front of an altar of a newly consecrated church. And we just saw wonderful examples of that from Syria and Palestine. The next slide, please. If the former, the relics would continue to serve their owner as a salvific token for the rest of their lives, and their heirs and family members well beyond if they are passed down, a practice well attested in late antiquity and throughout the Byzantine period, as seen in these two examples here, a reliquary necklace with these little tubes from the Cleveland Museum from the 5th, 6th century, and the famous reliquary pendant with the depiction of St. George here on the exterior in the British Museum in London from the 13th, 12th, 13th century. Depositing relics in the altar tomb of a church, however, was in some ways even more beneficial, as it guaranteed their continued efficacy on behalf of an entire community of Christian faithful for countless generations. Late Roman and Byzantine sources do not usually comment on the ways in which relics were enshrined prior to their reburial in an altar. But among the verse inscriptions composed by Paulinus of Nola, one described such a reliquaries as having been placed, quote, beneath the lighted altar and covered with a royal slab of purple marble. One simple casket embraces a holy band, and in its tiny bosom embraces names so great, end of quote. A number of such seemingly simple caskets have been excavated in sanctuaries in northern Italy, the Balkans, Asia Minor, and elsewhere, and we've just seen the examples from further east. The next slide, please. The fragments of the famous ivory casket from Pola, for instance, were found in 1906 inside a large stone loculus, pictured here on the left, closed with a stone lid 4 inches thick, fixed shut with plaster, and embedded beneath the floor of the apse of the 5th century church. The richness of the decoration of the Pola casket stands in stark contrast to its hidden placement beneath the altar of the church. However, much like coffins that I discussed just previously, they were also briefly but spectacularly visible during the festive procession that accompanied their arrival in cities such as Milan, Rome, Constantinople, or Rouen, and again during the consecration ritual of the church that served as their final destination. The next slide, please. Such an episode, of course, and we've seen this slide before, we'll probably see it again, the Trier ivory. Such an episode is depicted in the famous ivory panel in the cathedral treasury in Trier, which likely formed part of a reliquary itself, possibly containing relics of the proto-martyr Stephan, Euphemia, or some other prominent saint or martyr, and I don't want to get into the hairy details of that discussion that you're all familiar with. Like the triple reliquaries excavated at Varna, the next slide please, and we've seen that before as well, which display a spectacular sense of material hierarchy, all enkynia or consecration reliquaries were permanently removed from the eyes of the faithful. Yet inscriptions were often used to commemorate the name or names of saints and martyrs whose relics were thus deposited. In the case of these two silver reliquaries from Grado, the next slide please, figural and symbolic representations were added to augment the epigraphic record. In other instances, pious donors decided to give permanence to the purpose or reason for their donation. The next slide. A marble reliquary in the Metropolitan Museum thus records that it was made in fulfillment of a vow by John the Bishop, while another one made of silver, now in an American private collection, was inscribed with an elegant cross and the formulaic invocation for the repose of the souls of Antoninus and Leoncia and for the salvation of Simeonionis and Maria. Evidence from across the entire Mediterranean and all phases of Byzantine history attest to the permanence of such consecration rituals and practices. In the capital Constantinople, two examples from the 10th century Lips Monastery, the next slide please, and the 14th century Kora Monastery, the Karia Jami today, are attested through excavation. While consecration reliquaries from the Middle and Late Byzantine period tend to be less spectacular than earlier examples in terms of their material and visual splendor, the tradition of enlisting Christian saints and martyrs in the protection of a community of the faithful remains unbroken throughout Byzantine history. They can do so with their whole as much as with their fragmented bodies, the saints that is, elevated above or resting below the church altar, because, as Theophrid of Echternach wrote around 1100, they have been transformed from earthly to heavenly clarity and are able to emit celestial light and cause their earthly remains to shine. They illuminate their dead bodies from above, wherever they are. Thank you very much for your attention. And I hope my timing is about right. For 15 minutes, we'll have some...
No, that was perfect. Thank you very much, Holger, for this projection across the centuries and the testimonies of the not to lose more time, I immediately call Brigitte Pitarakis du CNRS de Paris, donc toujours dans le monde byzantin, bijoux et croix reliquaires, les pratiques de piété privée sous une nouvelle lumière. S'il vous plaît.
Bonsoir à tous, merci pour cette invitation. Je vais essayer de montrer mon PowerPoint moi-même et si je n'arrive pas, je vais vous demander de l'aide. Ah oui, maintenant...
Il faut tout simplement que vous choisissez votre PowerPoint sur votre ordinateur.
Oui, très bien.
Est-ce que c'est bon maintenant?
C'est bon, c'est bon.
Ok, je commence alors.
C'est mieux d'élargir l'écran.
Je vais le faire, attendez une seconde.
Oui.
C'est bon?
Oui,
merci.
C'est bien.
Merci.
Alors, le goût du luxe et le port ostentatoire de bijoux précieux font partie des stéréotypes combattus par les pères de l'Église au même titre que les pratiques de magie populaire issues du paganisme. En revanche, dès le IVe siècle, les fragments du vrai bois ont connu une diffusion universelle et la coutume de les enchâsser dans des bijoux s'insère dans les manifestations courantes de la foi chrétienne. Les sources du IVe siècle sont bien connues. Je voudrais néanmoins rappeler le témoignage de Grégoire de Nice au sujet de Macrine, sa sœur, qui portait constamment sur le cœur une corde sur laquelle était suspendue une croix en fer et un anneau dans le même métal, dont le chaton creux orné d'une croix renfermait un fragment de la vraie croix. Jean Chrysostome évoque de son côté la coutume chez les hommes et les femmes de son temps d'enchasser des parcelles du vrai bois de l'or et de les suspendre au cou en guise d'ornement. Tout en apportant un éloge à la vie ascétique, le fort contraste entre le fer et l'or dans ces deux témoignages fait ressortir la valeur inestimable du vrai bois. Au 7e siècle, dans la vie de Jean le Meunier par Léonce, évêque de Naples, on trouve ensuite l'une des premières mentions explicites sur une croix reliquaire pectorale d'or, renfermant un fragment du vrai bois. Le détenteur est un certain Jean, évêque de Tibériade, réfugié à Alexandrie suite aux invasions perses. Dans une approche diachronique allant de la période proto-byzantine au Xe siècle, je propose de présenter une typologie des principales catégories de bijoux et croix reliquaires en me concentrant sur les pratiques d'orfèvrerie correspondantes et l'évolution des comportements pieux. Les critères d'identification des reliquaires, leur fonction et la relation entre le décor et le contenu seront au cœur de la discussion. Dans le vaste répertoire de croix pectorales proto-byzantines qui nous sont parvenues, l'identification sans ambiguïté de reliquaires du vrai bois n'est pas aisée. Au VIe siècle, on constate pour les bijoux un goût, un intérêt pour la forme de boîtier fait de fines tôles d'or soudées. La substance de remplissage résineuse visant à consolider l'objet et empêcher son écrasement pourrait prêter à confusion, de même que les cavités ménagées sur la croisée des bras ayant perdu leur cabochon. Un critère déterminant pour identifier un bijou reliquaire, est l'accès matériel ménagé à la relique. Il existe une catégorie peu étudiée de bagues à double chaton du 6e-7e siècle, serties d'un grenat. Je n'ai malheureusement qu'une mauvaise photo prise sur une vieille photocopie. Sur cette bague de la collection Hélène Staphatos au Musée national archéologique d'Athènes, le petit chaton accolé au grenat est creux. Une croix ajourée, montée sur charnière, lui sert de couvercle mobile. On peut supposer qu'une particule de la vraie croix noyée dans du baume y était originairement enchâssée. Le petit pendentif en alliage cuivreux découvert à Sardes en Asie mineure dans une tombe du 6e-7e siècle introduit un autre type, inspiré peut-être de la forme des ampoules de pèlerinage. Le boîtier circulaire fait de deux moitiés creuses est pourvu à son sommet d'une vis indiquant la présence d'une relique ou de l'huile sainte. Sur une face, une petite croix faite de fils torsadés se termine par des volutes à ses extrémités, alors que les petits anneaux de fils torsadés sur le pourtour devaient à l'origine retenir des perles de pâte de verre. Un mécanisme de fermeture similaire se présente sur une croix pectorale d'or niellé découverte à Rome dans une tombe près de Saint-Laurent hors les murs. La croix, datée du 5e-6e siècle, était posée sur la poitrine du défunt. La vis au sommet fait office d'anneau de suspension. Elle se referme sur une petite cavité reliquaire. Dans une troisième catégorie de bijoux reliquaires proto-byzantins, on trouve de façon récurrente une inscription au génitif désignant un ou plusieurs saints. J'ai pu identifier deux variantes. Le petit boîtier rectangulaire en or ajouré conservé à Dumbarton Oaks porte à son sommet un couvercle coulissant. Servant de support à 3 anneaux et à une inscription gravée suggérant d'identifier une relique de Saint Zacharie. On lit Tuahiu Zacharia. Une petite croix gravée sur un grenat à l'avers s'apparie à une autre croix au repoussé inscrite dans une couronne de laurier au revers. Le décor de cet objet dit avoir été trouvé à Constantinople, sujet à une attribution au 5e siècle. 3 églises dédiées à Zacharie sont attestées à Constantinople. Mais on pourrait supposer aussi, peut-être, que la relique provenait de Korikos sur la côte de Cilicie, où un culte de Zacharie, probablement père de Jean-Baptiste, est bien attesté. Un sarcophage reliquaire conservé au musée de Séleucie, avec les reliques enfermées dans un coffret en plomb, avait jadis été publié par Gilbert d'Agron. D'autre part, une inscription funéraire de Korikos d'un certain Jean Notaire mentionne l'église de Saint Zacharie de Korikos. L'objet a pu enfermer un minuscule caillou ou du baume mêlé à de l'huile parfumée ayant été en contact avec la relique sainte. La présence d'une parcelle de la vraie croix noyée dans de l'huile issue des reliques de Zacharie est peut-être également envisageable. Les contacts entre la Cilicie et Constantinople ont très tôt contribué à la transmission du culte guérisseur accompagné d'une production locale d'objets de piété privés. C'est le cas, par exemple, du sanctuaire des saints Com et Damien au Cosmidion, près des Blachères. Un petit reliquaire en or niellé daté du VIe siècle, conservé au British Museum, fut associé avec ce sanctuaire. Sur une face, 2 scènes niellées montrent la composition générique de la nativité de l'adoration des mages. Le revers porte une croix sur degrés entourée d'une inscription apotropaïque. On lit « Le salut assuré et l'éloignement de tous les maux ». La somme de chacune des lettres de l'inscription équivaut à 6130, ce qui correspond à la valeur numérique du cryptogramme qui accoste la croix. Sur la tranche de l'objet court une inscription désignant les saints Com et Damien. Pour Cyril Mango, le décor de la verre s'expliquerait par la proximité topographique avec le sanctuaire de la Vierge des Blachères. Des fragments de baume desséchés sont encore préservés dans le creux du boîtier. On pourrait se demander s'il ne s'agirait pas de la kérotie, un mélange gras à base de cire contenant aussi des parfums et des pharmacopées distribués de façon rituelle au Cosmidion. On ne saurait exclure cependant, sans pouvoir le démontrer, la présence d'un fragment du vrai bois qui peut-être était noyé dans du sérat médicinal. La croix, faite de 2 volets creux réunis par des charnières et suspendue par une grosse bélière mobile, est le reliquaire par excellence de la pré-iconoclasme. L'agencement du décor vise la mise en valeur des dogmes de l'incarnation du salut. Les exemplaires les plus précieux montrent plusieurs croix imbriquées l'une dans l'autre. Un couvercle ajouré au-dessus de la relique laisse apparaître le bois d'où s'échappe le parfum du baume et des huiles parfumées qui recouvrent la relique. Au cours de ce procédé rituel, le fidèle peut toucher et embrasser la relique. La célèbre storothèque Fieschi Morgan au Metropolitan Museum of Art, datée du début du IXe siècle, offre quant à elle l'un des plus anciens témoignages d'une version miniature du type de coffret rectangulaire pourvu d'un aménagement cruciforme au milieu. Le pouvoir des fragments du vrai bois est renforcé par l'intercession des saints qui occupent le pourtour du boîtier. Les images viennent ajouter leur pouvoir à celui des reliques. La combinaison des émaux cloisonnés translucides et des grandes plages de niel sous le couvercle intérieur sont des innovations techniques du IXe siècle qui contribuent à renforcer la dissémination de nouvelles pratiques de piété. Une croix reliquaire pectorale en bronze niellé au monastère Sainte-Catherine du Sinaï, daté du Xe ou tout début du XIe siècle, offre le rare témoignage d'une inscription dédicatoire attestant la présence effective de parcelles de la vraie croix. Le Christ en croix sur une face de l'Annonciation, Visitation, Nativité et le baptême, alors que sur l'autre face, une ascension atypique s'associe à la descente au limbe ou anastasis. Dans la scène de l'ascension, 7 figures identifiées par des inscriptions se démarquent du collège apostolique habituel. On y trouve les saints médecins comme Damien, le prophète Habacuc, Jean, Élie, André et Thomas, qui est le saint homonyme du donateur. On lit « Par la puissance des vénérables bois, garde, ô Christ, Thomas, ton serviteur. Ô Christ, roi, créateur de toutes choses, conserve et garde Thomas, ton serviteur, et les autres, par le dessein de celui-ci. » La fin de l'inscription, exprimée de façon maladroite, est difficile à interpréter. La forme Ketalipa est probablement un raccourci pour les membres de la famille de Thomas. Le terme Rafi peut s'appliquer dans ce cas tant à l'écriture qu'au dessin. Chez Théodore Studite, par exemple, le terme vient à désigner l'acte du dessin pour la confection d'images saintes sur tout type de support, comprenant tant des voiles liturgiques que des icônes peintes. Sur la croix de bronze, ce sont des images niellées, comprenant aussi une ascension personnalisée au revers. La question pourrait se poser de savoir si Thomas ne serait pas l'artisan ayant confectionné le décor de cette pièce. Les dédicaces d'artisans ne sont cependant pas courantes à Byzance. Et de façon conventionnelle, c'est la piété du commanditaire qui est considérée comme étant à l'origine de l'œuvre. Une exception célèbre vient de la dédicace en grec des portes en bronze de saint Paul hors les murs, confectionnées à Constantinople, à Rome, les portes envoyées à Rome, confectionnées à Constantinople au XIe siècle. Dans son invocation des saints Pierre et Paul, l'artisan ayant réalisé le décor niellé des portes se qualifie de rapsonta. L'artisan y a donc ajouté sa prière qui en même temps lui a servi de dédicace. Enfin, la catégorie de bijoux destinés à enfermer des reliques individuelles de saints est également attestée dans l'après-iconoclasme. Un petit reliquaire en or niellé de la collection Schlumberger au cabinet des médailles, daté du Xe, XIe siècle, porte sur une face l'inscription Lipsanon tuaiu Stephanu tuneu, identifiant une relique d'Étienne le Jeune, martyr de l'iconoclasme. Cette relique pourrait être mise en rapport avec la procession annuelle organisée à l'occasion de la fête du Saint, connue à travers le témoignage d'Antoine de Novgorod au XIIIe siècle, selon lequel la tête du Saint était portée en procession par les parcs de la ville vers la grotte où celle-ci était supposée avoir été originairement jetée. Les reliquaires de ce type peuvent être approchés de petits boîtiers qui encadrent les fragments de la vraie croix sur les reliquaires plus grands. Un tel exemplaire est le triptyque reliquaire du monastère de Lavra au Moatos, attribué au Xe siècle en raison d'une légende l'associant à Nicéphore Phocas. Les reliquaires qui encadrent la relique du vrai roi se présentent chacun comme un incolpion. Un petit reliquaire en forme de fiole porte l'inscription Tuaiu Extratiu précédée d'une croix. La formule est similaire à celle des bijoux reliquaires proto-byzantins. Pour conclure, cette étude nous a permis d'explorer un réseau de relations étroites entre les instances religieuses, le rituel ecclésiastique, les fidèles et les orfèvres. Nous nous sommes situés dans un contexte urbain qui se différencie des mécanismes de pèlerinage aux lieux saints. Les reliques abritées dans les incolpias s'intègrent dans un rituel qui en fait des sources de guérison intarissables. La présence récurrente d'une combinaison avec des inscriptions désignant des saints, notamment sur les bijoux reliquaires proto-byzantins, est un sujet qui mérite quelques réflexions ultérieures. Tout en annonçant la présence de fragments du vrai bois, le motif de la croix pourrait aussi avoir pour fonction d'authentifier une relique sainte, bénir l'objet et son détenteur. Merci.
Merci pour cette communication tout à fait éclairante. Aussi, j'ai relevé au passage cette remarque très intéressante sur le développement de l'iconographie qui intervient en concomitance avec l'irruption de nouvelles techniques au IXe siècle et qui pourrait aussi peut-être amener à réfléchir sur ce qui se passe précisément en Occident juste à la même période. L'iconographie connaît aussi un développement important sur les reliquaires. Bien, merci encore et je passe tout de suite, passo subito la parola a Elisa Possenti dell'Università di Trento che darà ella stessa l'introduzione alla sua relazione, la relazione per ragioni di difficoltà tecniche sarà letta da un'altra persona in seguito. Dunque chiamo Elena Possenti.
Sì, grazie, buongiorno. Chiederei alla professoressa Pitarakis forse di togliere la condivisione del suo schermo, ma forse ce la faccio, no, ecco lo stesso. Ecco qui, condivisione, presentazione dall'inizio. Ecco, buongiorno, vi ringrazio di questo invito e quindi passo la parola a chi leggerà il mio testo. Grazie.
Buonasera a tutti. Gentilissimi colleghi e presenti, ringrazio in primo luogo sentitamente Eleonora De Stefanis e l'organizzazione del convegno per avermi invitato a presentare in questa sede i risultati di un contributo recentemente pubblicato sull'uso delle croci reliquiario bizantine, così come si è configurato grazie al censimento dei reperti rinvenuti in contesti archeologici chiusi. Lo studio a cui alludo nel titolo del mio intervento è il frutto delle ricerche di Francesco Granzotto, in cui invece parlo dal momento che l'autore è recentemente scomparso. Il legame personale che ci legava e l'aiuto che gli ho dato nelle ultime fasi redazionali del testo spero giustifichino il fatto che oggi parlo al posto suo. L'articolo di Francesco Granzotto aveva in realtà considerato sia gli encolpia di tipo bizantino sia quelli di tipo russo. Nel complesso, come ci si poteva aspettare, la distribuzione degli encolpia da contesti chiusi si è rivelata particolarmente consistente nelle aree dell'impero d'Oriente o in quelle zone che politicamente gravitavano su Costantinopoli o che da Costantinopoli erano state culturalmente influenzate, sia come effetto dei processi di cristianizzazione guidati dalla Chiesa ortodossa, sia nell'ambito di specifici rapporti politici. Il maggior numero di esemplari è pertanto noto oltre che in Asia Minore e Grecia, soprattutto nella penisola balcanica, anche se una discreta quantità è stata censita anche in Italia, fino a quel momento sottorappresentata rispetto alle altre aree gravitanti sul Mediterraneo. Le croci reliquiario erano utilizzate in primis come portareliquie. La documentazione raccolta fa tuttavia intuire che questo tipo di oggetti potesse aver avuto, al di là del valore prettamente religioso e devozionale, un significato più articolato in cui si intravedono componenti apotropaiche, scaramantiche, forse addirittura al limite con la superstizione, Un'ipotesi suffragata anche dal rinvenimento al loro interno, oltre che di fibre tessili, interpretabili come possibili reliquie da contatto, anche di peli o pellicce di animali, oppure frammenti di legno carbonizzato. Ai fini del nostro discorso va inoltre rilevato che gli encolpi costituiti da 2 valve sono stati talora rinvenuti incompleti, ovvero ne è stata recuperata una sola valva, una condizione che, come vedremo, non deve essere necessariamente spiegata con la perdita accidentale dell'altra metà, ma piuttosto determinata, almeno in parte, dall'uso che se ne fece, collegato ma distinto all'originaria funzione di portareliquie. In primo luogo, gli encolpia erano destinati ad essere portati al collo da persone vive. A livello di record archeologico, questo utilizzo è confermato dalle sepolture, dove, almeno in alcuni casi, il manufatto intero è stato rinvenuto sul petto del defunto, anche di sesso femminile. Geograficamente le attestazioni risultano distribuite tra l'Asia Minore, la Bulgaria, l'Ungheria, la penisola balcanica, Croazia, Macedonia, Serbia e l'Italia meridionale. Che la posizione dell'encolpion sul petto non fosse casuale è confermato anche da altri manufatti coevi, quali le più semplici croci pettorali o addirittura alcuni frammenti fittili con croci incise, documentate in Bulgaria e a Creta, ritenute una variante a buon mercato delle croci reliquiarie o pettorali. In altri casi gli encolpi, talora combinati con altri tipi di croci nella medesima tomba, potevano essere posizionati anche in modo diverso, nelle mani del defunto oppure sotto o sopra la testa. Una posizione quest'ultima che richiama un uso ben noto in ambito funerario, perlomeno a partire dall'Alto Medioevo. Un esempio particolarmente significativo è al proposito costituito da una tomba rinvenuta nell'area necropolare esterna alla chiesa di Pella, Grecia, dove il defunto, oltre alla croce stretta nelle mani, aveva sul petto anche una croce pettorale in ferro. A Paciuri di Malvito, Cosenza, l'encolpion era invece sotto la testa. Nella terra di riempimento delle sepolture sono invece sempre testimoniate valve singole di encolpia, una situazione che fa sospettare che gli inserimenti fossero finalizzati ad una protezione in senso lato della sepoltura. Esempi ancora una volta sono noti nell'area balcanica e greca. Proprio questa peculiarità induce a ipotizzare che gli encolpia, quando rinvenuti singolarmente e interi, gli esempi sono numerosi, ma senza indicazioni sulla posizione, fossero in origine posizionati sul petto, tra le mani, sopra o sotto la testa. Dall'Italia esempi sono documentati a Brindisi, Maldonato, Otranto e Canne, in area pugliese. La provenienza della terra di riempimento della tomba non era tuttavia un'esclusiva delle singole valve d'encolpia, dal momento che sono testimoniate anche semplici croci, o meglio, frammenti di croci. Le croci reliquiarie non sono però documentate solo in ambito funerario. Tra le soluzioni individuate, una posizione di primo piano è riferibile agli encolpi rinvenuti nei luoghi di culto, già oggetto di studi pionieristici da parte di Giovan Battista De Rossi e Nicodim Kondakov alla fine dell'Ottocento, e quindi nel secondo dopoguerra di Angelo Lipinski e Antoine Frollo. In questo ampio gruppo il censimento ha verificato diverse varianti. Limitata all'Europa occidentale, a dire il vero, quasi esclusivamente all'Italia, è la presenza di encolpia deposte all'interno di sepolture di santi e martiri più antichi, nella diapositiva indicati con i puntini neri. In questo caso, l'encolpion, da una parte, fissa per noi oggi il momento della realizzazione o riapertura dell'Arca Santa, dall'altra però doveva in antico aumentare ed esaltare la santità del contesto. Era infatti un portareliquie appoggiato, inserito tra le spoglie di un corpo venerato. Parlano a favore di questa ipotesi i singoli esemplari rinvenuti nella tomba di San Marco e di San Niceta nella chiesa di San Nicolò dei Mendicoli a Venezia, nella tomba di San Celso, inglobata nell'altare della chiesa milanese omonima, nel sepolcro di Papa Leone III, nel vano sotto l'altare della chiesa di San Lorenzo in Palazzo a Roma, nella sepoltura di San Proto, nella chiesa di San Gavino a Porto Torres e da ultima nella tomba di Santo Eremita Guglielmo a Scicli, dove tuttavia era presente una singola valva. Un secondo gruppo è costituito da encolpie funzionali alla consacrazione di un altare, località indicate in verde, ma non associati ai resti mortali di un santo o martire, pertanto rinvenuti da soli o con altri oggetti, quali ampolle per contenere oli, frammenti di lucerne, anche pezzi di stoffa o cera. Esempi sono stati rintracciati in Francia, Spagna, Italia e penisola balcanica. Le soluzioni, limitandosi anche in questo caso ai soli encolpi di tipo bizantino, potevano essere diverse. Inseriti nella muratura dell'altare, come a Fornovo in provincia di Parma o San Pedro de Roda in Spagna, sotto la struttura o sotto uno dei pilastri dell'altare, Fiano Romano, Ragusa Ibla, ma anche San Michel d'Aiguille in Francia, oppure in una piccola fossa prospicente ed adiacente la fronte dell'altare, come a Novi Pazar in Serbia o Zborianov in Bulgaria. Un terzo tipo appare costituito da un discreto numero di reperti rinvenuti nell'ambito dell'edificio di culto, ma senza un contatto fisico con l'altare. Parte delle croci rinvenute rientravano certamente nel gruppo degli ex voto o offerte battesimali che si ritiene fossero anticamente appesi alle pareti o incastrate nelle colonne delle chiese, soprattutto di area ortodossa, di cui in alcuni casi si sono conservati gli incastri. A questi avrebbero potuto appartenere, seppure non in modo esclusivo, gli encolpi rinvenuti a contatto o in prossimità dei perimetrali interni degli edifici. Alcuni casi però sembrano testimoniare un uso diverso, legato ad una funzione filatteria delle croci reliquario nei confronti dell'edificio e della comunità che lo frequentavano. Facendo fede ai resoconti di scavo e alle loro descrizioni, sono infatti noti encolpi rinvenuti a qualche metro di distanza dall'altare, o inseriti nei piani pavimentali delle chiese, oppure sepolti in qualche metro di distanza nell'artece senza una chiara relazione con sepolture. Anche gli esemplari, rinvenuti in prossimità dei perimetrali esterni di una chiesa, rientrano forse in questa casistica. Sono infine da ricordare edifici diversi dalle chiese, per quanto di culto o legati al culto. Tale è il caso degli encolpi rinvenuti nei pressi di battisteri o addirittura in un caso di una croce reliquiaria avvolta in un panno di lino e rinvenuta inserita tra i mattoni della torre campanaria di Eberbach, non lontano da Heidelberg, in Germania. Tutti questi esempi suggeriscono pertanto l'ipotesi che le croci reliquiario, oltre che per un uso individuale finalizzato alla devozione personale e alla protezione contro il maligno, fossero anche ritenute funzionali alla protezione di intere comunità che affidavano a questi oggetti, fortemente simbolici, il principale luogo di riferimento per la comunità stessa, la Chiesa. Coerenti con questo scenario sono gli encolpi rinvenuti in contesti profani. Tra questi la maggior parte relativa ad esemplari interi provenienti da edifici residenziali per lo più indagati nelle aree bizantine. Una condizione particolare è quella degli encolpia rinvenuti in strati di crollo o di incendio che si ritiene fossero stati originariamente appesi alle pareti delle case. Queste ultime, per lo più ubicate nelle aree satellite dell'impero bizantino, sarebbero state distrutte, a seconda dei casi, durante le guerre russo-bizantine di fine X secolo, dagli attacchi di Peceneghi agli inizi dell'XI secolo o dagli arabi. Possiamo ricordare come esempi il monastero fortificato di Nogezia in Romania, il sito di Odarci in Bulgaria, distrutto dai Peceneghi nel 1032-1036, una casa di Aindara in Libano, abbandonata nell'XI secolo probabilmente in seguito ad attacchi arabi. La funzione protettiva in senso lato è tuttavia deducibile anche da altre modalità di recupero. Ci si riferisce agli encolpi sempre interi, mai valve isolate, rinvenuti interrati davanti alle porte degli ambienti abitativi. Un esempio è a Filippi in Grecia, oppure inseriti nel pavimento imbattuto degli edifici. Un utilizzo quest'ultimo testimoniato soprattutto in Romania e Bulgaria, ma almeno in un caso anche in Italia, a Monteiato, Palermo. Qui fa pandan un secondo ritrovamento a Buonvicino, Cosenza, in cui la croce è però di tipo diverso. Un ulteriore esempio, a cavallo tra ambiti laici ed ecclesiastici, è costituito dall'encolpio trovato a livello delle fondazioni del monastero di Faras, nella Nubia egiziana. In linea di continuità con gli utilizzi sopra descritti sono alcuni encolpi rinvenuti in centri fortificati o in villaggi delle aree di confine, che in alcuni casi sono stati ricondotti alla presenza di soldati bizantini. Il rinvenimento è stato effettuato sia genericamente nell'area dell'insediamento, come nel villaggio di Oyuk in Turchia, prossimo alla linea di confine con i territori arabi, ma anche nei pavimenti delle torri o immediatamente all'esterno del muro di cinta, ancora nelle necropoli, secondo le modalità viste sopra. Un caso a parte sono invece gli encolpi trovati in antiche fortificazioni di età proto-bizantina, rioccupate da villaggi dei secoli centrali del Medioevo, come Ravna in Serbia. Encolpi a bronzei sono stati infine rinvenuti anche all'interno di tesori, dove la loro presenza sembra essere tuttavia determinata più che dal valore del manufatto e dalle eventuali reliquie, sulla cui effettiva presenza non abbiamo indicazioni, soprattutto dalla protezione in senso lato esercitata dalla croce reliquiario. Nel caso del tesoro 121 di Pekari Kniaz Gora in Ucraina, l'encolpio in bronzo intero era infatti associato a pregevoli manufatti in argento. Nel tesoro di Preslav, Bulgaria, probabilmente interrato durante un attacco di peceneghi costituito da gioielli e altri preziosissimi reperti in oro e argento, era invece significativamente presente solo una singola valva bronzea. Ricordo infine un encolpion, oggi disperso, con provenienza da una catacomba romana non meglio specificata. Al di là del contesto della funzione, purtroppo irrecuperabile, si tratta in ogni caso di un dato interessante, dal momento che conferma come gli antichi cimiteri sotterranei fossero in un qualche modo frequentati anche in epoca così tarda. Emerge quindi come nel mondo mediterraneo, soprattutto di ambito bizantino, ci fossero tratti comuni nell'utilizzo degli encolpia, in particolare nell'uso funerario. Emergono tuttavia anche specificità regionali, nell'ambito delle quali proprio l'Italia sembra occupare un posto ben definito, in particolare nell'utilizzo delle tombe dei santi e dei martiri. A sua volta l'Occidente sembra aver privilegiato rispetto all'Oriente gli encolpia bizantini per la consacrazione di altari. Aree molto militarizzate, in età bizantina, sono invece quelle che hanno restituito le testimonianze più legate all'ambito protettivo a largo spettro, nelle case e nelle fortezze, ma anche nei tesori. Un ulteriore aspetto a cui si può solamente accennare è come la presenza di questi oggetti non appaia circoscritta nelle aree afferenti o nell'orbita dell'impero bizantino e soprattutto non sia esclusiva di contesti funerari e cultuali riferibili alla liturgia orientale. Aspetti quest'ultimi, relativi alla modalità di diffusione degli oggetti, che non sono stati affrontati nell'articolo di Francesco Granzotto, ma che si intende affrontare nel testo che verrà consegnato per gli atti.
Grazie per questa bellissima relazione che ci è giunta come complemento assolutamente ideale a quello che si era detto nelle precedenti. E una varietà considerevole di usi di questi oggetti. Ci sarà da tornarci nella discussione probabilmente. Now I'm going to call Manfred Luchterhand for the final relation of this session. Again, about problems between Orient and Occident, the popes and the Eastern Mediterranean, the early Middle Ages, the reliquaries of the Sancta Sanctorum, and the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. Please, Manfred.
Thank you very much. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, yes, perfectly.
Okay. The popes and the Near East after the Muslim conquest, relics and identity in a migration society. First chapter, the Muslim conquest. When in 737 Caliph Umar conquered Jerusalem, it was unpredictable which role the city would play in the future topography of the Muslim world. Only 20 years ago, Muhammad had changed the orientation of his first mosque from Jerusalem to Mecca, disappointed by the refusal of Jewish families to join his new interpretation of monotheism. Contrary to their later role, the city was not of primary interest for the conquerors, who focused more on the capital, Caesarea. After first raids in Bethlehem, it still lasted 3 years before Umar forced the handing over of Jerusalem, which only 2 generations later underwent its Islamic redefinition by Abd al-Malik's Temple Mount. However, its religious interpretation remained ambiguous up to the 11th century until the first Arabic pilgrim guides. So the questions how the new masters of Palestine looked at Jerusalem's Christian tradition is difficult to answer because the textual evidence is sparse. While hagiographic sources report on massacres and destructions, archaeological research proposes different scenarios from rapid decline to slow transitions from late antique to Islamic Palestine, in which the new upper class of Arabs largely adapted the material culture of late antiquity, as you still see in Beit Shan or Anjar. Apparently, this also applies to the veneration of holy sites. Although Jerusalem was not mentioned in the Quran, the use of churches and holy sites for Muslim prayer seems to be common at an early stage, as Mattia Guidetti and Ute Verstegen have examined. The earliest evidence is from the Katisma, the octagonal building near Bethlehem, which enclosed the rock on which Mary had once rested, together with Caesarea, one of the models for the later Dome of the Rock. Already in the 7th century, a mihrab towards Mecca was set up in its ambulatory. In the Church of the Nativity, Muslims early used the south apse for the same purpose. In the Holy Sepulchre, a place for prayer was installed in the narthex, which later was associated with Omar, the first conqueror. Already the wooden mosque on the Temple Mount, mentioned by Arkulf, can be seen as an attempt to link the tradition of this site to the everyday practice of Muslim worship. All these prayer places were on the periphery of holy sites. Their orientation towards Mecca does not reveal to what extent the Muslims adapted or rejected the Christian veneration of places and relics. In some cases, we have evidence that relics survived the regime change. Material evidence of this offers the Great Mosque of Damascus. While a Muslim prayer hall was erected next to the St. John's Church, it was not until 706 that Walid II incorporated the Christian sanctuary into a huge mosque in which Christians now had to admire the relics as guests of the new religion, nevertheless in a style very familiar to them, with the basilica, columns, atrium, marble mosaics, a reliquary shrine. The new religion was now dominant, but it remained within the cultural repertoire of an Eastern polis. All these developments were not to be expected when Arab tribes first approached Jerusalem as conquerors and enemies. Maybe the Christians had other expectations about the future of their holy sites, because only a few years ago they had witnessed how Christians were massacred by the Persian army, the Holy Sepulchre devastated, the cross transferred to Khosrau's palace in Ctesiphon, their most important relic. These fears could explain why exactly in these years 2 important relics left the Holy Land. The cross relic, venerated since the 4th century, and the relic of the crib, venerated in Bethlehem. Both left Jerusalem in different directions. While the cross relic made its way to Constantinople, where the Hagia Sophia became the center of its cult, the crib relic was soon worshipped in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which under Pope Theodore for the first time received the epithet ad praesepe. At first glance, these 2 translations do not pose a problem. They could be interpreted as rescue missions, following the example of Aeneas, who saved the Palladium from Troia to bring it to a new place with a better future. For the cross relic, this process has been well studied. In the case of Rome, we know the Pope, under whom Santa Maria Maggiore was first given the title ad praesepe, Theodore I, son of a bishop of Jerusalem. He was elected 5 years after the city's conquest, and in 649, together with Palestinian monks, initiated the Lateran Council against the religious policy of Heraclius. That the Pope played an important role in this transfer seems obvious, but this fact doesn't answer a lot of questions. Which kind of network made possible the transfer? Who really had the authority in Jerusalem to give away such an important relic? And what role did the objects play in the new environment? Today, it's my aim to integrate this problem into a wider horizon of political, social, and cultural networks that emerged at this time. Additional help comes from the analysis of a relic hoard, which according to its paleographic evidence was established at the same time, the Sancta Sanctorum in the Papal Palace in Rome. It allows conclusions about the routes and channels and the persons by which relics from Jerusalem became more and more available in early medieval Europe and especially Rome. Rome and the East during the Muslim conquest, actors, networks, modes of communication and travel. To start with the last point, it was McCormick's study of the post-antique Mediterranean that finally refuted the thesis of Pirenne that the armies of Mohammed broke up the economy of the Mare Nostrum. Today we know that the new antagonism of Byzantium and the Caliphate did not end the communication networks of late antiquity, but created new ones. From 700 to 900, more than 800 movements of traders, diplomats, clerics, pilgrims, more than for a year documented. Nevertheless, using all the relics at Saint-Echelle for reconstructing such movements, McCormick left out an important collection, the papal relics in the Roman Lateran Palace. When the medieval shrine of Leo III in their chapel was reopened in 1903, its compartments were found to contain a unique ensemble of reliquaries boxes and wooden containers whose provenance from Byzantium, the Near East, and Sicily documents the extensive cultural relations of the popes. The most are simple wooden boxes without the rhetoric of reliquaries. Their written labels bear unique testimony to the international character of the papal economy. According to the cedulae, the collection probably began in the 7th century. They document more than 59 relics from the Holy Land, only few saints from Rome, but many from Syria, Palestine, and Egypt's regions that were strongly affected by the Muslim conquest. For some Eastern saints, such as the Coptic Amos and Arsenius, or the Judean desert fathers Chariton and Theoctistos, these authentics provide the first evidence of a Roman cult. This makes the collection important evidence of the upheavals in the Mediterranean, as well as of the role of the papacy in these events. A mapping of the objects show relics from 14 biblical sites, the majority in groups of 4 to 8 objects, which probably came to Rome together. The many repetitions suggest that they were accumulated through various missions whose destination was often Jerusalem. Most of the relics came from the vicinity of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the Jordan, or Jericho. If one also takes into account the saints' relics, we find destinations typical of travel routes of this time, from southern Italy to the coast of Asia Minor, Cyprus, and Syria, along the southern route via Alexandria and the Sinai. The first route was taken by the Anglo-Saxon Willibald, who traveled from Syracuse via Cyprus and received his transit papers in Syria. The second was taken by the Frankish pilgrim Bernard, starting in Rome. In Taranto, he boarded a ship to Alexandria, thereafter taking a well-established pilgrim route via Gaza. The individuals who acquired the relics frequented the main pilgrimage sites, but had different interests than Western pilgrims. Largely ignoring Galilee and focusing on Jerusalem and the Desert Fathers, the papal relics more reflect the interest of Eastern monks, who are known to look after many of the holy sites, many as guardians of certain relics. Their preferences are confirmed by the catalogue of Epiphanius, the only Greek pilgrim guide from that time. It shows the same focus on Jerusalem, the Sinai, and the tombs of the Desert Fathers as the Sancta Sanctorum. I guess that this treasure was largely built up by diplomatic contacts through monks who traveled between Palestine and the Roman diaspora, and in Western sources are called negociatores. Especially the many relics from the Holy Sepulchre suggest that they ended up in the papal chapel as diplomatic gifts that accompanied official letters. From Roman sources, we know that such gifts were customary between clerical institutions. The correspondence of Gregory I contains references to 37 relics in 800 letters, culled from a corpus of around 20,000. They mention relics for Jerusalem and Alexandria, mostly given in the response on the request of other patriarchs. We know also that the papal chancery had form letters for such ordered relics, along with a procedure under the control of priests, mostly in St. Peter's. It is not exaggerated to suppose also for Jerusalem a real relic industry used by the Patriarch for his diplomatic efforts, for example, when he asked other potentates for financial help. This prefabrication of such relics can be studied by the 2 stone caskets in the Sancta Sanctorum. This prefabrication of such relics can be studied in the 2 stone caskets in the Sancta Sanctorum, arranged in a cross. Both show triangular and round carved stones, obviously to distinguish the holy sites, to identify them for the writer. The left is labeled from the Anastasis. Instead of pilgrims vandalizing the Holy Sepulchre, we have to think rather of clerics who prefabricated such relics in a standardized form like pilgrim bottles, maybe using the late antique walls of the church. This patriarchal network seems to have worked well up until the 9th century. Already Pope Gregory's correspondence with Alexandria includes 13 letters, which would have entailed more than 26 journeys. One mentions the Navis Alexandrina, which still in the 9th century supplied papyrus for the Curia. In this way, at least 5 relics of Alexandria were sent to the Lateran. In regard to Jerusalem, it is known that papal officials brought money to the Holy City and took back eulogia. Other occasions were synodal letters sent by new elected patriarchs to their counterparts. Gregory sent his letters to Antiochia, Jerusalem, and Alexandria with a relic of St. Peter's, recommended as protection against sickness. The Patriarch of Constantinople made similar use on his monopoly of the relics of the cross. Already in 638, Alexandria received a dogmatical letter together with a staurothek. And still in 811, Nikephoros enclosed such a staurothek in a letter to Leo III. You can imagine a gift like the Fieschi Morgen staurothek from the possession of Innocence IV, barely bigger than a matchbox. It is likely that only some of these gifts were placed in private chapels that were predestined to accommodate such signs of friendships. Roman Jerusalem and the struggle on monothelism. What do we know about Roman Jerusalem during the Arab conquest? The strongest evidence is from the struggle on monothelism, in which more than 200 documents indicate a high mobility of persons, letters, and manuscripts. It began around 620 when the Palestinian intellectual John Moschus from the Theodosius monastery fled from the Persian army first to Alexandria, then to Rome with his friend Sophronius, and established a circle there. When John died and Sophronius brought his body back to Bethlehem, there was already close contacts between this group of exiles in the new Sabas monastery on the Aventine and the Curia. Elevated to the Patriarchate, Sophronius, in his struggle against monothelitism, immediately directed his efforts towards the Pope. Up to 649, his legate, Stephan of Dor, a city near Haifa, undertook 3 journeys to Rome, we know, the first during the conquest of Bethlehem and Jerusalem. In Rome, this Roman-Palestinian alliance soon led to the election of Theodore I and to the planning of the Lateran Synod of 649 under the leadership of Eastern monks. When Sophronius died, the Pope appointed Stephen Vicar for Jerusalem, an office that later was extended to Antiochia. The amount of travel entailed in this remarkable interference by the papacy in the Eastern Patriarchates is evident from Stephen's report in 649, in which he wrote that during the Arab siege of Jerusalem, Sophronius made him swear an oath at Golgotha to position Rome against the monothelites. To put it clearly, for some decades after the Muslim conquest, there was no patriarch in Jerusalem, only a vicar who ruled on the behalf of the Pope. It is likely that the popes in this vacancy negotiated directly with the Caliph in order to protect the Church of Jerusalem and its pilgrims. Evidence from this comes from the trial of Martin I. In 654, the Byzantines accused him of negotiating with the Muslims to help the Christians in Palestine. I suspect that Martin's predecessor, Theodore, initiated this agreement with the Caliph, feeling himself responsible for the fate of his native city. In the long run, this meant that Frankish pilgrims, like Willibald or Bernard from the 8th century on, usually received their transit papers in Rome and not in Byzantium. This deal was an advantage for the Caliphate. Unlike Byzantium, the popes were no threat to the Arabs. Relics in post-antique migration societies. Back to Santa Maria Maggiore. It is no surprise that under Theodore I, Presepe Chapel is documented in Santa Maria Maggiore. From later sources, we know that it had walls covered with silver, perhaps imitating the grotto of the Nativity. As a new locus sanctus, this place was unique in Rome and was later furnished with an icon of Mary and included in the papal Christmas liturgy. That Theodore arranged the transfer is plausible on chronological grounds. It was the strong alliance of Rome and Palestine, and above all the appointment of Stephen as vicar, that gave him the authority and to hand over to the Pope a relic of this rank. The 3 journeys to Rome could be an ideal occasion. Was it a rescue mission, making the papacy tear its share of responsibility? In his Christmas sermon of 634, Sophronius had lamented the occupation of Bethlehem, which prevented the Patriarch from venerating the relic of the crib. In Rome later, it was Maximus again who called for protection of the holy sites, whereas the Pope compared the enemies of the earthly Jerusalem to those of the heavenly. I suspect that also the long schism in the Patriarchate of Jerusalem between clerics who allied with the emperor and those who allied with Rome caused the 2 most important relics to leave the holy city in different directions. They were saved not only from the Arabs, but also from the opponent party. The installation of the crypt relic in Rome demonstrated the Pope's determination to preserve the memory of Arab-occupied Palestine, but it would be too simple to reduce this process to a papal top-down initiative, a kind of relic policy. For the liturgy of the cross, which was adopted in the same years, around 650, we know that this feast was first celebrated in some titular churches and not in the papal liturgy. This suggests a larger diaspora of Eastern Christians who had an own interest in bringing their familiar rituals with them to their new home. A similar interaction of papacy and diaspora we can finally observe in Theodore's second project, the redesign of Santo Stefano Rotondo. In the 7th century, this church of the first Jerusalem saint, with its reminiscence of Eastern architecture, was not well integrated into the papal liturgy. But every year it was the site of a splendid feast in December, which according to the liturgical books was of great importance. According to Guido Baldi, it was Theodore who initiated the new Schola Cantorum to strengthen the integration of Santo Stefano in the papal liturgy. To upgrade the church, he installed the Primus and Felicianus chapel with a cross in the mosaic, which evidently took up the iconography of the Jerusalem relic as we know them from pilgrim bottles. According to a lost inscription, it was dedicated to the memory of his father, the Jerusalem bishop, without revealing whether he was buried in the church. But since memory always needs a community as bearer of memory, it is very likely that Santo Stefano was a meeting place for the Jerusalem community before, not only on St. Stephen's Day. Next to the church was San Erasmo, an important Greek monastery dedicated to a popular saint from Antiochia. This should remind us to see relics not only as part of a top-down controlled politics, but following approaches in cultural anthropology as things of high religious value with the potential to shape and to integrate communities to define a certain kind of segmented public, to stabilize groups and their identity in common rites. For the Oriental community in Rome, Santo Stefano and the Chapel of Presepe were not only places that remembered Jerusalem, but also a material recognition of their particular identity within the Roman Church. They visualized common values and stabilized that community by a ritual presence that had to be confirmed again and again. So let's imagine the Christmas festivities there and on St. Stephen's Day not only as papal propaganda, but rather as important events that strengthens the ethnic identity abroad. You meet, you celebrate together, and at the end you go to a table with the monks eating Oriental food, slaughtering or lambs or other things. For strangers from another culture, life in a split identity was too challenging to refrain from such events. Who could know better than we, confronted every day with the presence of such practices in our modern societies? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manfred, for this relation, which brought out so many precision about the networks and the ways used for this transfer of relics, and the importance of this relic in themselves for the, if it can be said, the spiritual structuration of the Occident, Rome firstly, and the entire Occident after that. Thank you very much. Now we have to open the discussion again. learn to employ this system now. We have several questions already, but probably there will be some other ones. I begin with the first, which has been written by Eleonora De Stefanis per Elisa Possenti. Se può leggere quello che è scritto? Gli incolpi ritrovati nei piani pavimentali avevano qualche forma di segnalazione? E seconda domanda, si individuano forse materiali diversi per croci con funzione e contesti d'uso diversi?
Sì, allora, dunque, per quanto riguarda gli incolpi nei piani pavimentali, in realtà la documentazione di scavo fa capire che gli incolpi praticamente erano inglobati nel battuto, quindi come se fossero stati sepolti sotto il battuto o comunque inseriti nel momento in cui si realizzava la pavimentazione. Questo è un po' il dato che è emerso dalla documentazione di alcuni scavi archeologici, cioè in moltissimi casi in realtà gli incolpi sono stati trovati al di sopra dei piani pavimentali e quindi rientrano nella casistica di incolpi che o erano appesi alle pareti o forse sono stati persi, ma ripeto, in alcuni casi la relazione di scavo fa capire che non erano sui piani di calpestio, erano sotto o inglobati all'interno appunto dei piani pavimentali. Per quanto invece riguarda i materiali diversi per croci con funzioni e contesti di uso diverso, allora in realtà il censimento che io ho riportato e che non ho fatto io aveva fondamentalmente censito le croci del piano bizantine in bronzo. Diciamo che è stata poi registrata la presenza, che comunque c'è, di altri manufatti in cui però cioè, se c'è una differenza è che la presenza è percentualmente più bassa. Forse in alcuni casi può far alludere anche a un contesto più modesto, ma non direi che c'è una differenza.
Grazie.
Grazie. Sei soddisfatta, Eleonora?
Sì, è un dato estremamente interessante sia in un caso che nell'altro. Ero molto incuriosita da questa presenza appunto di materiali di questo tipo inseriti nei pavimenti, quindi appunto che potrebbe avere anche un significato simbolico evidentemente,
Sì.
no?
Io anche davanti nel caso di Filippi in Grecia c'è questa fossa proprio davanti all'uscio dove è stato inserito e trovato, cioè è stata scavata la fossa e all'interno della fossa, che è proprio davanti alla porta, è stato trovato l'encolpium intero. Cioè, quindi questo è il dato archeologico. Poi è chiaro che l'interpretazione fa pensare che la cosa non fosse stata casuale, che ci fosse una certa intenzionalità. Sì.
Ricorda riti molto più antichi anche.
Esatto, infatti per quello si dice non è solamente una componente devozionale, una componente propriamente di culto, ma è qualcosa quasi come che è molto simile all'amuleto in un certo senso e che ritorna anche nel fatto, per esempio, nelle sepolture dove quando sono nella terra di riempimento sono mezze valve, quindi insomma è un po' anche questo fa pensare,
Grazie molte.
Allora, vedo sullo schermo che invece di altre domande ci sono soltanto saluti di alcuni ascoltatori che hanno dovuto lasciare la riunione, ma forse ci saranno vere domande da fare ancora. Non so, ne avrò una a indirizzare a Marie-Christine Comte. À propos, vous avez mentionné tout à l'heure, alors j'ignorais tout à fait, le cas de ce reliquaire syrien qui a été donc attesté dans une église de Marseille, si j'ai bien noté. Alors bon, je pense que ce serait sans doute à mettre en relation avec ce qu'on sait par des sources textuelles mérovingiennes sur l'activité sans doute de marchands et d'autres membres de communautés syriennes qui sont venus s'établir dans le sud de la Gaule à cette époque, sans doute.
Oui, probablement. Probablement, c'est une influence de marchands syriens, de communautés qui circulaient et qui allaient dans le sud.
Et on n'a pas d'autres. C'est le seul exemple qu'on a en gros.
Oui.
Enfin, il est quand même assez significatif.
Ah oui, oui.
Et on n'a pas, par exemple, d'autres. Je pense à d'autres régions, par exemple en Italie du Nord, où on a l'attestation, je pense à ce qu'on connaît à Aquilée, à Grado, de communautés syriennes importantes, justement, en Italie, à partir du 5e siècle. On n'a rien trouvé d'équivalent, à votre connaissance.
Pas que je sache, non. Voilà.
Merci. Ci sono altre domande? Dunque, se non c'è niente di più per questo pomeriggio, mi permetto di ringraziare calorosamente tutti i relatori e augurare a tutti voi un'ottima serata, un'ottima notte e dunque a domani ci troveremo.